Imagine experiencing a sense of dread. I believe we can all recall a moment when something felt off. Some might refer to it as a premonition, while others might call it intuition or a gut instinct. Some may even view it as a divine message from God. In today's case, however, the woman foresaw her own murder just hours before it occurred. She confided in her loved ones that she had an ominous feeling that someone intended to take her life, and then it came true. This is one of those narratives that sends a shiver down your spine and prompts you to reevaluate everything and everyone around you. Let me start by introducing you to Valerie Reyes. She was born on April 9, 1994, in New Rochelle, New York, to her parents, S. Reyes and Norma Sanchez. She was one of 4 kids. She had an older brother and 2 younger brothers, the youngest of whom came along when Valerie was 17 and 19. But despite their age gap, Valerie was super close with her younger brothers, and she absolutely adored her older one. Being the only daughter, she was definitely her parents' little princess. New Rochelle is a vibrant and diverse suburb in Westchester County, New York, right by the Long Island Sound. Valerie grew up in a safe, quiet neighborhood where families had known each other for years. Her parents worked hard to give their kids a stable home environment, teaching them the importance of family, education, and working hard to make a better life. Valerie's family had strong Mexican roots, and their closeness and support for one another were at the heart of everything they did. Valerie fit right into this close-knit family, always prioritizing the ones that she loved. Growing up, Valerie enjoyed painting, loved animals, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian one day. When she was just 6 years old, the Journal News did an article on school diversity and featured Valerie. Even at the young age of 6, she showed her compassionate nature by helping her classmates with their Spanish. She said, "It's fun for me to teach them, like a teacher." That compassionate and selfless spirit was something that stuck with her throughout her life. Valerie went to New Rochelle High School, where she met her best friend, Jeffrey Anderson. They met when they were both 14, forming a bond that lasted well into their adult years. At school, Valerie quickly became known for her kind heart and her genuine care for others. She had this incredible ability to sense when something was wrong with someone, call it intuition, and she would always offer help at the right moment. She approached everything with warmth and empathy, making her incredibly approachable, even to people she didn't know. Valerie grew into a beautiful young woman with a bright smile, striking brown eyes, and a quiet, friendly nature. She wasn't the type to seek the spotlight, but she was a very talented person. Valerie also found joy in simple things, like hanging out with friends and family. Even though her little brothers could get on her nerves, she was also serious about her studies and was involved in plenty of after-school activities. Though friendly, her friends described her as more reserved, preferring smaller, intimate gatherings over big social events. Valerie's sweet and gentle nature matched her interests perfectly. Painting, reading, and writing are things you usually do by yourself in a quiet place, and she had a passion for spending time doing these things outdoors. She was the kind of person who loved deeply, always there for anyone who needed her. She was the type who would drop everything at a moment's notice to help someone she cared about. Her mom, Norma, often talked about Valerie's huge heart and how she was the kind of daughter every parent dreamed of, caring, loyal, and full of love. When Valerie graduated high school in 2012, she wasn't quite sure what she wanted to do with her life. College didn't seem to appeal to her at the time. It felt a little too restrictive for someone as free-spirited as she was. All she knew was that whatever she did, she wanted to use her creative talents. Her older brother was a tattoo artist, and she looked up to him so much that she began considering following in his footsteps. Valerie was an incredibly talented artist herself. She could draw spot-on portraits and would do this for her friends, family, and anyone she cared about. She even let her brother tattoo her arm, allowing him to practice his craft on her body, which alone shows how much she trusted and respected him. Valerie was also passionate about reading and could lose herself in a good book for hours. Her best friend Jeffrey would say that Valerie was a homebody at heart. She loved going to coffee shops with a book in hand, or spending quiet nights sketching. Valerie was also a talented singer, though not many people knew about that since she kept many things very private. She wasn't one to boast, but she would open up to those she felt close to. Most of her closest friends were family members, like her cousins, aunts, and her maternal grandparents, Jose and Graciela Sanchez. They lived nearby, and Valerie loved spending time with them, often dropping by without notice, which was always a pleasant surprise. Of everyone in her life, her bond with her mom, Norma, was the strongest. Norma had Valerie when she was just 21, and as the only women in the household, they developed an unbreakable bond. Norma saw Valerie not just as her daughter, but as her best friend. Even after Valerie moved out and started living on her own, she would talk to her mom every single day. Sundays were always reserved for family time, which became Valerie's favorite day of the week, as it meant gathering at her parents' house with her older and younger brothers. They'd all catch up on each other's lives. Norma said her kids always looked forward to Sundays. Valerie would play board games and hide and seek with her younger brothers, sharing fun and silly moments together. Sometimes they'd grab a bite to eat, other times they'd go to the park. They'd do anything really, as long as they were with family. Those moments together meant everything to Valerie. Valerie worked hard to enjoy the things that mattered most to her. She was good at saving money, living by her mother's motto, "When you're at work, you do work." Her friends said that she had the soul of an artist, but the work ethic of a CEO. One of her first jobs after high school was at the local Costco, where she met Shell Ellis. This coworker quickly became a close friend. Shell admired Valerie's humility, noting that while Valerie was incredibly talented, she never craved attention for it. They clicked instantly. Shell said Valerie would draw freestyle while Shell cooked, and Shell had the honor of being one of Valerie's portrait subjects. Shell saw just how gifted Valerie truly was and was ecstatic when Valerie's brother got her a dummy arm to practice tattooing on. Shell could tell Valerie was thrilled to help him pursue his dream, while honing her own tattooing skills. As well, by the time she turned 21, Valerie had moved into the basement apartment at 34 Colonial Place in New Rel, staying close to her parents because she only lived 3 or 4 minutes away. It wasn't long before Valerie saw that a new bookstore, the Barnes & Noble, was opening soon, and it was only 15 minutes away in East Chester. She loved books. We know that she always carried them around with her, and she was looking for something new to dive into all the time. So when she saw this job being advertised at the bookstore, she applied right away and joined the very first team of employees when it opened for its grand opening. This included Lauren Bradford, who was 5 years younger than her. Valerie made quite an impression on Lauren, who was only a teenager at the time. In the 10 months that they worked together, before Lauren went off to college, Valerie shared her passion for art with her and her dreams of becoming a tattoo artist. Lauren remembered Valerie as a confidant, someone that you could really go to if you needed advice, and she encouraged Lauren to go after all of her aspirations. Lauren knew this was solid advice because it was obvious that Valerie had a good head on her shoulders and a very bright future ahead of her. She encouraged a lot of her friends to follow their dreams, including Michael Follow, who said if it wasn't for Valerie, he wouldn't have learned digital art. She saw his sketches, and she persuaded him to get an iPad and an Apple Pen and just to create. But behind Valerie's bright smile and her encouraging and compassionate nature, there were things that people didn't always see, a skeleton in the closet, so to speak. She struggled with bouts of depression and anxiety, something that many creative souls can actually relate to. Valerie often used art as a way to escape during those darker times. She was the type to retreat into her own world, surrounding herself with paintbrushes and pencils whenever life felt overwhelming. Valerie also found peace in nature, especially on long walks around Beachmont Lake. It was a beautiful area, perfect for sitting by the water on a bench under the trees and just watching the ducks swim by while listening to the water from the fountain hit the lake surface. It's really pretty in the winter as well, with all the snow and ice. Valerie would spend hours just sketching or soaking in the quiet calm. For her, it was the perfect way to reset. You can tell that Valerie's life was simple yet filled with love, laughter, and a strong sense of purpose. Reading and art were her escapes, a way to express herself without saying words or to find an expression for how she was feeling in someone else's words. As much as Valerie enjoyed the slower pace, she was also quite the hard worker. She worked as much as she could. Her boss and colleagues described her as someone who was always punctual, dependable, and respected. She was known to have a ferocious work ethic, and her customers adored her as well. They often commented on her friendly smile and her willingness to go the extra mile to help them find the perfect book. As a neighbor, Valerie kind of kept to herself for the most part, but she would still say hello when she saw her neighbors on Colonial Place. However, one of those neighbors ended up becoming a friend. Brenda DJ, a mother of 5, used to say hi to Valerie every now and then when she would see her come and go during the week. But when Valerie brought a new puppy home, all the neighborhood kids just rushed over and wanted to see it, and that instantly made Valerie very popular on their block. Valerie and Brenda also bonded when Valerie noticed Brenda's tattoos, and she mentioned that her brother was actually a tattoo artist. After that, they began talking more and more, and every morning they would have a conversation about whatever was going on in their lives. Valerie would often inquire about Brenda's children. If she didn't see one of her kids for a couple of days, she would say, "Oh, are they okay?" Which Brenda thought was a really sweet gesture. While Valerie was naturally quiet and reserved, she actually wasn't a stranger to love and relationships. She was a very beautiful woman who attracted a lot of attention, especially from men, and she dated on and off, like many people her age. She was always very giving in relationships, and sometimes to a fault. She would often put the needs of her partner before her own, which nearly always led to heartbreak. Valerie's mom, Norma, recalls that she could be too trusting at times, and that she believed there was goodness in everyone. She always wanted to see the best in everyone, but these aren't bad things. However, they are things that could easily make you vulnerable and easy to take advantage of. As Valerie entered her mid-20s, she began to look ahead to the future. She dreamed of things like traveling and exploring new places. She spoke to her friends and her family about wanting to see the world, but her family was worried that she was naive about the dangers that could lie in these unknown places. They, of course, supported anything she felt was right. So, to start off 2019, she decided to take a trip to Alaska, and she really started to spread her wings. But soon tragedy would strike, seemingly out of nowhere, and it would send shockwaves through her extended group of family, friends, and ripple effects extending to her co-workers and her quiet neighborhood. So let's jump to Sunday, January 27th, soon after she returned from her Alaska trip. That day, Valerie, her parents, and her brothers met up for their weekly meal at her parents' house. There was nothing out of the ordinary about that day. Valerie was her normal self. They laughed, played games, and after eating, the kids did all the cleaning to give their parents a break. Valerie had to work the next day on Monday, but she had Tuesday off, so she and her mom made plans to go shopping at Home Depot together. On Monday, January 28th, the next day, Valerie went to work as usual, but it was when she came home that something changed. That evening, she texted her mom that she felt nervous. She also texted her best friend, Jeffrey, saying that she felt worried about something she just really couldn't put her finger on. She had a dark feeling looming over her, a sense that something bad was going to happen to her. Of course, Norma was concerned. She wanted to know what this was all about. That's when Valerie called her in a panic. Norma thought it might have something to do with a recent breakup. Just 4 days before this, on January 24th, Valerie had ended a relationship with a guy named Justin Orta, and Norma knew that Valerie had been troubled after the breakup, especially because she was now all alone in her apartment, with Justin no longer being there to keep her company or keep her safe. Norma asked Valerie if her fears had anything to do with Justin, and she said no. She said she just had a lot of panic in her voice. So Norma had asked her to come stay with her, but she said, "No, Mama, I'm okay." However, she wouldn't stop going on and on about how frightened she was to be all alone in her apartment. She said she just could not shake her fear. So Norma pressed her even more. Valerie let her know that there was no one specific she was afraid of, but she was hearing about all these murders of young women, and she couldn't get them out of her head. Then she literally said to her mom, "I feel like somebody's going to murder me." That's very chilling, and of course to her mom, she was so desperate for more information. She was prying and prying, trying to get her daughter to tell her more, but Valerie refused to specify why she felt that way. Maybe she really didn't know why, but Norma kept pressing, asking, "Is there someone at your house?" She said no. She asked again, "Is it your ex-boyfriend Justin?" And she again told her no, it wasn't him. It was just a feeling. Valerie also confided in her mom about having anxiety attacks lately, and that she was becoming scared and paranoid of being alone. Norma knew that Valerie could become anxious here and there, but she was usually a pretty positive person. So, this was very worrying for her mother. For her to be this bent out of shape wasn't normal. Valerie told her she was going to try to go get something to eat and calm down, so she left her apartment to visit a local market just around the corner, where she bought some groceries before returning to her place. Later that night, she did text her mom, "Good night," and she told her she finally ate and that she was feeling better. She also promised she would calm down. Norma was confused about what was going on with her daughter, but she knew she was going to meet up with her the very next day, and they would be able to talk through how she was feeling, and she would get to the bottom of it. At the same time, Valerie had been texting Norma. She had also been texting her best friend Jeff with the same concerns, telling him the same thing, that she thought someone was going to kill her. He wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it just Valerie worrying about something she'd seen on the news regarding crime in the neighborhood? Or had someone made an actual threat against her? Valerie never answered that question, but Jeff tried his best to be there for her. By 11:35 that night, she finally said goodnight to Jeff, texting him, "I'm a knockout now. My eyes can't open anymore. LOL." The first sign that something wasn't right was the next day, on Tuesday, January 29th. Norma was now waiting for Valerie to show up at her house. They were going to go on their shopping trip, but she never dropped by. Norma tried reaching out, calling her, and texting her, but Valerie never answered her calls or responded to any of those texts. Norma thought her daughter was probably just tired. She needed some sleep, especially after how overwhelmed she was the night before. So she just let it go and let her be. But Norma wasn't the only one not getting an answer from Valerie. Family members and friends had reached out and never got a response either, which wasn't like Valerie. Still, the alarm bells were not going off yet, since there were times when Valerie liked being alone. It was the next day, on the morning of Wednesday, January 30th, when Valerie didn't show up for her shift at Barnes & Noble, that her co-workers became concerned, and they started reaching out to her family. Norma knew right away that something was wrong. She said, "This isn't Val. We talk all the time, so it's not like her to just not answer her phone." She knew in her heart that something was wrong. She hadn't been seen for 2 days now, and concerns were growing. It was completely out of character for Valerie to suddenly lose contact with her family, and even more unusual for her to miss a day of work without notice. Valerie was always reliable. She took her job very seriously. So, this kind of behavior was alarming, especially since she just told her mom the day before that she was afraid someone might try to kill her. Norma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. All calls to her cell phone went directly to voicemail, suggesting her phone was either off, or it had died, or it was broken. Her mom, dad, and her now ex-boyfriend of under a week wasted no time. The three of them went to the New Rochelle Police Department at 2:43 p.m., filed a missing persons report. Norma relayed to the officers that Valerie was so upset on the night before, on Monday, that she could barely speak, and she thought that someone was going to murder her, and now this. It was too eerie considering that she had gone radio silent. They explained that the last time they physically saw her was on Sunday, and then Norma and Jeff had spoken to her on Monday night, both of them talking her through her fears, with her last text to Jeff going out at 11:35. No one had heard from her since. One of the first steps the police took was to search Valerie's Colonial Place apartment in New Rochelle. There weren't any clear signs of a struggle, but forensic analysis did uncover small traces of blood in several spots. a faint stain on Valerie's pillow, 2 tiny spots on the bathroom floor, and another on the toilet. However, these were so minimal, they didn't provide much information. The police also noted that several of Valerie's belongings were missing, including her iPhone, her iPad, her wallet, and some items of clothing and bedding. While this might suggest that Valerie had left voluntarily, her friends and family were adamant that she would not just disappear without giving any notice, given her recent fears that someone was out to harm her. The police started leaning towards the possibility of foul play and that she was possibly kidnapped. Naturally, one of the first people they looked into was her ex-boyfriend, Justin. This recent breakup could have given him a motive. However, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect and even became very active in the search for Valerie. He handed over his cell phone and his iPad to be analyzed, and her mom and dad gave the police a recent picture of their daughter and information pertinent to being able to put in a missing persons poster. Her family immediately began making copies of the poster and distributing it all around town and on social media. No time was wasted creating a Facebook page to help find Valerie. Her family and friends began posting right away, asking if anyone had seen her. Others were posting hopeful messages. One of her cousins said, "I hope you are okay, I love you." There were also some assumptions and false information posted there as well, as per usual when groups like this are created. One person claimed they were a family member of Valerie's and that she had been last seen on Monday, January 29th, walking to a New Rochelle train station. Now this actually was not true, but it was shared on a bunch of other platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and it only hindered the investigation, but noted the fact that Valerie was a grown woman with the ability to leave on her own. Her parents felt like they weren't going to get the help they really needed from law enforcement. So the family actually hired a private investigator the very next day. This PI thought he had tracked her to a Manhattan ATM around 2 a.m. because he was looking through her transactions, and one of them appeared to come from that location, but he wasn't on the right track. However, this PI continued to look for images of women he thought could be Valerie, and he thought he spotted her at 6 a.m. on Wednesday, January 30th, the day after she was reported missing. Now, to be fair, detectives in New Rochelle that were working on her disappearance showed her mother this photo of the surveillance video of a woman at a Chase Bank branch near Radio City Music Hall, and Norma positively identified the woman on camera as her daughter, Valerie. But it turned out she was mistaken. In these stressful moments, it's really not uncommon for loved ones to make mistaken identifications of images. Most of the time, it's wishful thinking. They want to believe that's their daughter, that's their loved one. But this threw off the search, because now there was a new description sent out to the public stating that Valerie was last seen wearing a green coat, black jeans, and black shoes, and was in Manhattan, New York, when that wasn't even her. But that wasn't known until later, and this is all too common, especially with social media. The false information can spread very quickly with how easily it is to just share something. Most people mean well and are trying to help, but a lot of times, it only makes things worse. Valerie's ex-boyfriend Justin was also posting about her, identifying himself online as her boyfriend, even though they had been broken up before she went missing. I understand that may have been just to make things easy, or maybe not to look suspicious by saying that he was her ex. But either way, he started posting on Twitter the same day they reported her missing, pleading for her return. One post said, "My girlfriend Valerie is now officially reported as missing nationwide by the authorities. Please contact me if there's any kind of information." But when the news outlets reached out to him for comments, he declined interviews. He said that he was too busy cooperating with police to offer any information. He then posted something very cryptic. He said, "What's done in the dark will always find a way to shine." I think that could look a little suspicious, but there wasn't anything to hold him on. The missing persons poster said, "Have you seen Valerie Reyes? 5 feet 3 inches, black hair, brown eyes, half a tattoo on her left arm, and a right forearm tattoo." They had the description of the clothing that was incorrect, but they said she was last seen wearing a green coat, black jeans, and a black pair of shoes. They also let it be known that she suffered from anxiety and depression. which I thought was interesting because I have not seen a poster that explicitly said that on it. This information was also tweeted by the NYPD Midtown North's account. I noticed she also had an eyebrow ring on her right brow and a very distinctive way of lining her eyelids with a cat-eye-shaped black eyeliner. She was sometimes seen wearing glasses. Despite extensive efforts by the police throughout New Rel and New York City, they initially had no luck finding any leads. That is, until the morning of February 5th, 8 days after Valerie went missing, when a 911 call came in at 8:23 a.m. A highway worker who was routinely sweeping the streets in that area was calling to report a suspicious red suitcase that they noticed about 15 feet off the side of the road in a wooded area along Glenville Road, just north of Stillman Lane, in the quiet residential town of Greenwich, Connecticut. This was in a whole other state, but the area bordered Westchester County in New York, and it was only a 20-minute drive from Valerie's new Michelle apartment. The road worker explained that he was in an area he frequented to maintain the roadways, and he immediately noticed the bright-colored suitcase that hadn't been there before. Anytime there's a suitcase somewhere, I think it's natural to wonder what's inside and why it's there. So he stopped and walked down the embankment to investigate further. However, when he got to it, he was a little apprehensive about opening it alone. So he called his boss, James Clifford, the foreman of the Public Works Department, and told him to come out to assist him. When James got there, they began to inspect the suitcase. They unzipped it, only to be met with a very foul smell. Once they peered inside, they were immediately confronted with a gruesome discovery. It appeared to be the body of a deceased woman. Now, I do want to point out that normally, during the warmer months, this area is dense with greenery and brush, but when this was happening, it was in the middle of winter. The trees were bare, the ground was wet with ice and melted snow, and you could see right down to this area where the suitcase was found. It was also a very bright suitcase, against the contrast of the winter's brown and black ground and barren tree branches, making the suitcase very hard to miss. Officers from the Greenwich, Connecticut Police Department were sent out to the scene. This area is home to just under 2,200 people and is considered a pretty small town. Things like this were not expected to happen here, so they quickly blocked off a portion of Glenville Road with police vehicles. No one could use this road unless they had to enter due to living in the area. While the scene was being processed for evidence, death investigators made their way to the suitcase and completely unzipped it, throwing open the top portion and exposing what was inside. That's when it became apparent that the victim was a female, estimated to be between 18 to 30 years old. They couldn't be sure, but they knew that this wasn't a child. She was in the early stages of decomposition, with mottling around her hands and feet. The victim's body was clearly forced into a position that allowed her to be stuffed in the suitcase. Her face had been wrapped with several layers of packing tape. She had shoulder-length black hair, was barefoot, and was wearing an unbuttoned shirt and denim jeans. She was bound at the ankles, the knees, and her hands were bound behind her back with what appeared to be white twine and more packing tape. Most of the tape had been placed over her mouth and chin area, and she had been beaten. There were obvious signs of head trauma, including bruising around the face and a large hematoma on her forehead. It wasn't clear where she had been killed, but it did seem as though this wasn't the location she died. They couldn't tell how her death occurred. They had to wait for the medical examiner to conduct an autopsy. The crime scene technicians combed the entire area for any pieces of evidence they could find, and by noon the body had been transferred to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Then the Greenwich Police Captain Robert Barry from the Detective Division held a press conference right in front of the location where the body had been found. He did this right in the middle of the closed-off road as reporters from the area came to ask questions. Now I will summarize what he said and want to point out some very important parts to focus on. Hey everyone, again my name is Captain Robert Barry from the Greenwich Police Department, Detective Division. Again, we had a homicide investigation that we're continuing from this morning. This remains an active homicide investigation. We're just about now finishing up processing the scene. Our last detectives and forensic detectives are finishing up as we speak. I do want to confirm the information that was out there a little bit this morning, but the victim was found bound at the hands and at the feet, and the victim was found in a suitcase. The victim has now since been removed from the scene. We have received numerous public tips, which is very appreciated. We are following up on each and every one of them. We do want to encourage the public to continue to call in those tips. Police do have a tip line, that's area code 203-63333. Again, that's 203-63333, and that is an anonymous tip line. We have received some leads on some, I would say, possible identifications of the victim, but at this point nothing is confirmed, so I have no information to release actually identifying the victim. We are following up on some leads. Our focus right now is obtaining the identification of the victim so that a proper notification can be done to the next of kin. It's always sensitive to us that every time we have a tragedy such as this, there's a family connected to it. We always try to keep that at the forefront of our minds, and our heartfelt thoughts and prayers go out to that family wherever they may be. As you heard, Captain Barry confirmed that the victim had been found inside of a suitcase. She was bound by her hands and feet, and I'm adding what was left out. She was also bound at the knees, or as they would say, she was hogtied. The captain didn't provide all of the details, but he did mention that they had some leads as to her identity, but they wanted to be able to notify the next of kin before just announcing that publicly, out of respect. He reminded everyone that every victim has a family connected to them, and I think that's really important. It does get forgotten sometimes. The captain answers the reporter. The captain explained that due to the temperature being cold, as well as the fact that the suitcase was in a low-lying area, it was even colder than the roadway. So they were dealing with a bit of complexity in those terms, and he told them that they would have to wait for the autopsy. Finally, one more important question was when the reporter asked how big the suitcase was. That's a fair question, considering there was a body found inside of it. The captain said he didn't have the exact dimensions, but for reference, it wasn't small enough to fit in an overhead bin on an airplane, so it was more of full-size luggage. Keep that in mind, because there will be more information about that later. Okay, so that wraps up what we can learn from the first few hours after the body was discovered. Now there was some drone footage and other footage of this area, so I'm going to be playing that for you. The area of this exact location was out of sight from nearby residences. There was a small depression on the east side of Glenville Road, near Stillman Lane, and it would appear that that would be a really convenient place for someone to park, which is probably why the person who did this chose this particular area of the road. Maybe they had actually been to this area before, maybe in the warmer months, and they remembered it being woodsy and dense with brush. But it was nothing like that this time of year. By the time they got there, they probably wanted to get as far away from the body as possible, so they still left her there, because clearly this wasn't really a great area to hide anything. Now all this information only left detectives with more questions. The next day the medical examiner conducted the autopsy and was able to confirm the manner of death was homicide. But interestingly, and I think we would know that by the way, I'm just pointing that out, they have to put it on the report. It's like she didn't tie herself up and put herself in the suitcase. But interestingly, even though she had head trauma to her face, the back of her head, and the front of her head, the official cause of death was homicidal asphyxia, which we actually do not hear very often. This is not the strangulation type of asphyxia. This is something that I actually have not covered before, but coincidentally, it has been in the news recently in the Sarah Boone case. She allegedly zipped up her boyfriend in a suitcase and left him there to die, and he was confined to a very small space over time and could not breathe. Asphyxia itself, as most of you know, occurs when the body doesn't receive enough oxygen. But forensically speaking, there are actually three types: strangulation, chemical asphyxiation, and suffocation. This one falls into the last category, suffocation due to homicidal intent to cause death. Someone placed her inside the suitcase when she was still alive, bound and gagged without the ability to breathe. Over time, she slowly suffocated to death. There was an increased likelihood, due to the head trauma, that the victim may have been unconscious before being placed inside the suitcase. We won't ever know if she regained enough consciousness to be aware of what was going on and that she was dying in a very terrible way. It's heartbreaking, and it does show the extreme sense of cruelty that Suitcase became her coffin. As far as her identity was concerned, it was known at the time that there was a missing woman in New York who matched the description of this victim. So Valerie's parents were notified on Wednesday evening, February 6th, that a body had been found, at which point her father and her older brother went down to the morgue, and they sadly made a positive identification of the body. It was 24-year-old Valerie Reyes. As you can probably imagine, this was devastating news, especially after Valerie had confided in her mother that she thought someone was going to murder her. It seemed like quite the premonition, unless someone had been threatening her life. That's what detectives wanted to find out next. Was there anyone close to Valerie who may have had issues with her who would want to harm her? The medical examiner did notice what appeared to be some skin underneath Valerie's fingernails, so clippings were taken to be analyzed. They also took swabs of her private areas and her chest to be tested for the presence of male DNA, but this could take weeks, if not months, to get results back. As word spread of the positive identification, the TIC community of New Rochelle was gripped by grief. Friends, family, and neighbors that had known Valerie as gentle, kind, and an artistic soul made her death even more tragic. Social media quickly filled with heartfelt tributes, photos, and memories shared by those who loved her. They remembered her bright smile, her love for books, and her genuine kindness that touched everyone that she met. Her father wrote on Facebook that a vigil would be held the next evening, on Thursday, February 7th at 5 p.m. at Glen Island Park in New Rochelle. He said, "At this unimaginably difficult time, we're asking for love, support, and respect for our family, for the loss of my beautiful daughter, Valerie Reyes, who is now resting in heaven." On Thursday, Norma went public to discuss her daughter and the fears that she shared with her. It seemed like Valerie truly had a genuinely bad feeling that something was going to happen to her, a feeling she could not shake. So was this more of a premonition than anything else? Some of you may not believe that can even happen. Some call it being psychic, others believe it's God. But gut feelings can be a real thing. Even though Norma was still wondering if anyone had threatened her daughter or did anything to make her feel uneasy, there wasn't any proof of that yet. So now, it just seemed like a very weird coincidence. Or maybe she was just very in tune to the vibes around her and was really able to pinpoint that something bad was going to happen. But there's more. They might think that she's just a runaway, that she's just, going into bad things or whatever. Norma wanted the public to know that Valerie wasn't a runaway. She wasn't into drugs, partying, or even going out late and getting into trouble. That was not her at all. She didn't like going to clubs. So, all of this just left Norma with more questions. Now that same night, Valerie's family held a vigil in Glen Island Park in New Rochelle. It was a cold, damp night, but that did not stop people from showing up and showing their support. A few hundred people, including dozens of Valerie's friends and close family members, huddled tightly together. Many of them were holding white candles, singing and praying in Spanish. A lot of people were crying. The gathering took place beneath the park's old German-style castle. There were women holding rosary beads beside circles of candles adorned with images of Mary or Jesus. Norma gave a very moving speech directed at the unknown person who had treated her daughter so cruelly. She said, "My daughter did not deserve whatever you did to her. My daughter was pure. My daughter was a good soul. You will be caught, sooner or later. You will get caught. I know it, I know it." She added that Valerie was amazing, and she wasn't just saying that because she was her mother. She said Valerie was a beautiful soul, a beautiful daughter, a beautiful sister, and amazing in so many ways. Then she told Valerie that she loved her. Valerie's best friend, Jeff, pulled out a keychain in the shape of a sandal from his pocket. It had the name Valerie inscribed on it. He told the media that he had bought it for her while he was on vacation in Mexico, but he never got the chance to give it to her. So now he planned on keeping it on his keys to remember her. As the vigil came to a close, they heard people shouting, "A la niña." The girl, spreading through the crowd, meaning the girl. Another man cried out, "Justice for Valerie." Within just a few days, a GoFundMe page was set up by a friend to help the family pay for funeral expenses, and it raised nearly $3,000 in just 3 hours. But soon, the case would take an unexpected turn. Remember those road workers who went out there and stumbled upon her body? Well, that foreman, James Clifford, when he had been called out there by his employee, became the subject of an investigation because this man took photos of the crime scene on his phone, including an image of Valerie, still bound with a visible head wound. It's pretty rude, disrespectful, and disgusting, in my opinion, and a lot of people shared the same sentiment, because then he took it upon himself to share these photos with other people. Now, sharing these photos was a clear violation of privacy, not only for Valerie but also for the integrity of the entire investigation. The last thing her grieving family needed was to see these gruesome images of Valerie circulating among Clifford's acquaintances. Unfortunately, one of the people Clifford showed the photo to was a business owner from Connecticut, and it's so sad for me to think about this because it's all money-based. He chose to share them with a media outlet, and when he did, he had to reveal where he got them from. That is how James Clifford was investigated. He didn't face any criminal charges, which I was pretty surprised about. Instead, he received a very minor disciplinary action, including a brief suspension. He was placed on paid administrative leave for like 5 days, and he was demoted as foreman for 6 months. And then he lost 5 vacation days and had to do a mandatory sensitivity training. But he claimed it was just an error in judgment. His attorney, Lindy Oro, who was representing him, said that taking that photo was not with any ill intent. She said it was actually the actions of a traumatized person who was stunned by what they encountered. She said he was actually devastated by what he found, and it was an obvious error in judgment to take a picture of it, but she argued that he certainly didn't have any ill will or bad intention. But I have to say I do understand being shocked about something happening, but I also think you have time to cool down, think about what you're doing, and yet you're still sharing these photos with other people. So, I don't really buy that. The public was outraged, and Greenwich First Selectman Peter Tess had to make a public apology on behalf of the county. He said Valerie was a daughter, a sister, and a cousin of a family who's suffering a tremendous loss at this time. The thoughtless and insensitive behavior by this employee was inexcusable. He extended his heartfelt condolences to her family. Now, there were many reactions throughout the community once Valerie's body had been found. Lucy Nolan, the Director of Policy and Public Relations at the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence, made a very bold statement to the news stations, explaining that the nature and way in which her body was found displayed an extreme example of the objectification of women. She said, "It's disgusting. As women, we've always been taught, and some men believe, that our bodies are for their gratification. Women are taught our whole lives that we have to look over our shoulders, have to be careful." Now, even though at this point in the investigation there was no evidence to suggest that this was domestic in nature, the article included this statement, correlating the way Valerie was found to the assumption that it was either a partner or a man who had forced himself on her and then discarded her afterward. Since 2000, there have been about 14 deaths related to domestic altercations per year in Connecticut. But remember Valerie's neighbor, Brenda? Well, she had noticed that Valerie wasn't around for a couple of mornings, but she just figured that she went on vacation again until she saw a Facebook post. It was on February 1st, and it had the missing persons poster posted. And when she saw that, she just started crying. Still, she was holding out hope that Valerie would be found safe. But then, when she learned of the discovery of the body, she could not believe it. She said, "It's disgusting, especially since the person who did this to her is still out there." Then, she commented about the road worker who took those pictures of her body, saying, "This is not a joke, it's someone's life." She explained how her children are horrified by the news. It's the first time something like that had happened so close to home. She said she feels like her children are now prisoners because she doesn't know where the murder took place. She doesn't even feel safe letting the kids out in their own front yard. Clearly, Valerie was so well liked and would be missed by so many people. The community wanted answers. So back to the investigation. Remember the private investigator initially hired by Valerie's family? Well, he had done some preliminary research into her bank statements, specifically related to her most recent transactions. New Rochelle and Greenwich detectives took over that part of the investigation, and her bank card became their main focus going forward. Since the last time she spoke to anyone was the night of Monday, January 28th, the investigators began looking at any transactions after that time. It turned out her debit card had been used at 5 Amman, January 29th, at a Chase Bank ATM close to her apartment in New Rochelle. It was only a 5-minute drive away, and $1,000 was withdrawn. The investigators pulled footage from a poll camera located in the bank area and did not see Valerie. Instead, they watched as a black Honda CR-V pulled up, parked across the street in a neighboring parking lot, and a person, appearing to be a man dressed in dark-colored clothing, exited the vehicle, crossed the street, and entered the bank vestibule outside, where the ATM was located. He looked like he was wearing a black hooded sweatshirt over his head, dark pants, and a pair of black sneakers with white soles. After a couple of minutes, he exited the ATM area, got back into the Honda, and drove westbound. This was their big break, their first significant lead in the case. Clearly, this man was in possession of Valerie's bank card. They began searching other cameras in the area for any additional sightings of the same black Honda CR-V. They also searched license plate readers and found a black CR-V license plate that was captured 2 minutes away, located at the intersection of North Avenue and Lincoln Avenue in New Rochelle. They ran this license plate number, which matched a 2017 black Honda CR-V registered to a company out of Flushing, Queens, New York, about a 20-minute drive away from Valerie's apartment. As they continued searching through bank records, they saw that another $1,000 withdrawal occurred on January 30th, the same day that Valerie had been reported missing. This time, the transaction was at an ATM in Midtown Manhattan. The following day, January 31st, a third withdrawal was made in Manhattan, followed by 2 more on February 1st and February 2nd. In total, $5,350 was taken out of Val's account from the time she disappeared until days before her body was found. On February 9th, detectives reached out to the company that had registered the car. It was a car-sharing company that lent vehicles to the public through an app on their phone. Once a user signed up and provided proof of a valid driver's license, they could pick up a car from the company's parking lots throughout the city without speaking to anyone. These cars were available 24/7. Let me circle back to the car because I want to tell you something else before I go into those details. Since there were 2 different states involved in this case, the FBI assisted with the investigation. They had returned to Valerie's apartment, trying to find anything of evidentiary value. Now it seemed clear that a struggle had occurred there. Despite the absence of substantial blood evidence, there were traces in at least 3 locations, 2 in her bedroom and 1 in the bathroom. It appeared that somehow the perpetrator had gained entry into her basement unit and that something had happened in Valerie's bedroom, perhaps on her bed. Afterward, the killer may have cleaned up in the bathroom. They collected various items, including some of Valerie's sketches of different people, hoping to identify and rule out everyone, especially any men she had drawn portraits of. This would suggest that the person had been to her apartment, perhaps sitting as she sketched them, and detectives wanted to rule everyone out. It was like having composite sketches of several different people right there in her apartment. They used Valerie's social media accounts to match most of the portraits to pictures of people on her friends list, but one portrait of a man couldn't be matched to anyone Valerie was following at the time. This piece of evidence, along with the car connection, was uncovered at the same time. The rental car company provided detectives with the name of the individual who had picked up the black Honda CR-V on January 28th and returned it on the 29th, within the time frame when Valerie had disappeared. His name was Javier Enrique da Silva Rojas. His driver's license information, including his address at an apartment building in Flushing, close to the rental car lot, was given to detectives. They pulled CCTV footage from the building and reviewed January 28th, spotting Javier on camera at 10:50 p.m., wearing a black hooded sweatshirt, black pants, and black sneakers with white soles. the same attire seen on bank footage showing someone using Valerie's debit card. Additional footage from the car-sharing lot showed the same man retrieving the black Honda CR-V at 10:55 p.m., just a short walk from his apartment. Later footage from his building showed Javier returning the next morning at 9:43 a.m., wearing a different outfit, a long coat, and carrying a duffel bag. He returned to the building and left minutes later without the duffel bag in hand. When the detectives compared Javier's face to the sketch from Valerie's apartment, it matched. It looked similar. So they pulled up Javier's Instagram account and started going through all of his photos, and it was an exact match to his profile picture. However, he wasn't someone that Valerie was following at the time of her death. There was, however, a photo that appeared to be of Javier and Valerie together in February of 2018, which he posted to his Instagram. But how were they connected? This photo looks like a selfie of both of them. They're in what looks to be a CVS pharmacy location, in one of the aisles, and it looks like they're together, friendly, at least friends. I don't know if anything more comes from this picture, but here is a really good picture of Valerie. Well, here's some background information on Javier D. Silva. Just like Valerie, he was 24 years old at the time, and while there weren't many details about the information on his background, he held dual citizenship in both Portugal, where he was born, and Venezuela, where he was raised in a middle-class family in a suburban area. He grew up in Caracas, which is the Venezuelan capital, and Javier studied journalism in college at a university in Santa Rosa. While growing up, he regularly traveled with his family to the United States, but in 2017, he decided to extend one of those visits. He entered the United States on May 8 of 2017 through a visa waiver program that allows people from certain countries to travel to the U.S. for business or tourism for up to 90 days without obtaining a visa. However, when his allowed time expired on August 5 of 2017, Javier chose not to leave, so he had been living in the country illegally from that time until the present. He told his friends he never wanted to return to his homeland because it was being run by an autocratic socialist dictator, his words at the time. When Javier came to the U.S., Venezuela was facing severe political and economic instability. The country's economy was collapsing, there were shortages of food and essentials, and there were protests happening in the streets all the time. So, Javier wanted to escape this entire situation. When he got to the U.S., he settled in Flushing, New York, where he initially worked some odd jobs, finding work at a cleaning company, and eventually switching to working as a barista at a local coffee shop. He loved traveling, enjoyed nature, and was passionate about photography. When he wasn't working, he traveled widely across the United States, posting photos of his visits to New York City, Washington, D.C., and other places to his Instagram account, which did have several thousand followers. In these photos, Javier has long hair. He's got that cropped beard. He kind of looks like the typical urban hipster. And over the years, it appeared from his social media presence that he had several girlfriends, but none of them appeared to be that serious, because they would be switched out for the next one. People that were close to him knew him as kind and thoughtful, and one of his friends, who went to college with him before he dropped out to move to America, said that he even tried to get her cancer treatments out in the U.S. When detectives did run a background check, Javier did not have a criminal record, so they wondered if he had obtained her debit card somehow, but had not been involved in her murder, or if he was the killer they were looking for. Detectives didn't think this was a coincidence. On February 8th, Javier shared a picture on social media showing off a new Apple laptop and computer monitor. They knew that it appeared that he had been the person in possession of Valerie's debit card. So, they wondered how he got those new things, but there had been other suspiciously similar withdrawals from the same account, starting back in September of the year before, in 2018. So, detectives needed to know more. They asked Valerie's family and friends if the name Javier sounded familiar, and sure enough, a friend of hers told detectives that Valerie had met Javier on a dating site and had briefly had a romantic relationship with him, maybe for 3 months, back in 2018. But interestingly, later in September, a few months after the breakup, this friend explained, Javier texted Valerie out of the blue with an apology because he said he mistakenly used her debit card information that he had obtained when they were together to withdraw funds from her account. He felt bad about it and wanted to reimburse her. Valerie then texted a friend and told them to handle the situation because she was not interested in communicating with him. Clearly, this dude sounds a little sneaky. He's a thief, of course, so it's no wonder Valerie seemed to have had enough with him and wanted her friend to correspond and get the reimbursement. She specifically texted this quote, "I don't want to talk to him at all or have anything to do with him." End quote. How do you mistakenly use someone's debit card information that you clearly had to either take a picture of or write down? You had to have a record of it somehow. But one thing detectives know is that the deceptive banking behavior is not something new, but Javier having possession of the actual card was something new and did seem to start the night in question. She wouldn't have willingly given this card to him. Norma let detectives know she didn't know Javier that well, but she wasn't a big fan of him. She explained that when he and Valerie met on a dating site at the end of 2017, by January 2018, they had officially started dating. She only met him once or twice, so most of what she knew about him she heard from her daughter. But she remembered him being very persistent when it came to asking Valerie to become his girlfriend. She also recalled him being a fan of horror movies, and he seemed much more interested in Valerie than she was in him. At first, things were in the honeymoon phase, and the couple even briefly discussed possibly living together in Valerie's apartment. But ultimately, she decided to end the relationship in April of 2018, so just about 3 months after they got together. She began seeing this manipulative side, this controlling side, to him and told him she needed a hiatus. He was very stubborn. He wouldn't take no for an answer. When Valerie initially tried to talk to him before the breakup, when it came to their differences, he was way more interested in them being more serious in a relationship than Valerie was, and it got too much for her. Norma actually referred to it as a tumultuous relationship, especially when he revealed his deceitful nature. When Valerie told him it wasn't going to work out, he guilt-tripped her by lying about his mom having cancer back in Venezuela. Because he was in the country illegally, he couldn't travel home to go see her, so he was trying to make her feel bad for him so that she wouldn't leave him. And we've seen this in other cases. He wanted to continue the relationship, and Valerie was a kind soul. She felt deeply empathetic toward him in a situation, and she couldn't bring herself to just leave him and break it off. But a few weeks later, nothing had improved in the relationship, and Valerie decided to end it for good in the beginning of April. Norma said they found out that his mom was not dying of cancer, and that really raised even more red flags. Valerie realized she needed to distance herself from him, but Norma said that he wouldn't stop contacting Valerie. He tried texting her and calling her after they broke up. He sent her a birthday text on April 4th and songs that were meant to express his feelings, but Valerie had no interest in keeping in contact with him, so she stopped responding and then blocked him on all social media platforms. He was apparently destroyed for a few months following the breakup. After that, they were no longer in regular contact at all. Their last known contact was September 13th of 2018, so about 5 months following the breakup. I briefly mentioned this. Javier texted Valerie, admitting that he accidentally used her debit card info and that he wanted to pay her back. She texted a guy friend that she didn't want to talk to him, didn't want to have anything to do with him, and asked if she could use her friend's account to accept the money that he wanted to send her. Following this exchange, Javier seemed to have finally figured out that Valerie was done and that no tactics were going to make her take him back. But all of this was more than 12 months earlier. So Norma wondered, what did Javier have to do with Valerie's murder? She had moved on since then with Justin and had been dating him for a while. Javier was old news. That's of course when they explained the debit card withdrawals that were happening since Valerie disappeared, and the man on the camera they were certain was Javier. Was he her killer? They didn't know yet, but after hearing what Norma told them, the detectives could see the classic patterns of a toxic relationship. Javier appeared to be someone desperate for control, and when he didn't get it, he could have become dangerous. From the beginning of their short relationship, Javier displayed what we know as love bombing. He overwhelmed Valerie with intense affection and attention that quickly escalated to a level of seriousness that she found uncomfortable. This tactic creates this false sense of closeness. This period of time can be very intense and make it harder for someone to recognize the underlying red flags. His refusal to accept the end of their relationship and his repeated attempts to stay in contact show his inability to let go and respect her boundaries. All of this added up, the moving too fast, the creating dependency through emotional manipulation, and using guilt to control his partner and make them overlook his flaws and his behavior. Now, these signs can be subtle at first, but they often lead to more obvious forms of control. In Valerie's case, they signaled to her that Javier had the potential to escalate his behavior into more concerning actions when his manipulations stopped working. So Valerie did the right thing in this situation. She left before things got to a point of no return. She was able to get away, but the question was, did Javier truly move on, or had he been stewing all of these months? Especially when he found out that she was dating Justin. Was he planning the ultimate revenge by not letting anyone else ever have her, by taking her life? It was their biggest lead. He had a motive, and he still had her number. He knew where she lived. Could he have possibly convinced her to talk to him that night and let him inside? Investigators had a way to try to find out. They had enough evidence to get a warrant for his arrest on larceny charges for the illegal use of her debit card, and a search warrant for his apartment and the vehicle he rented. They also got his cell phone data, and on February 11th, officers from both the New Rel and Greenwich Police Department actually arrested Javier, and he was detained as they carried out their searches. While that was going on, they brought him in for an interview, but he denied having anything to do with Valerie's murder and acted as though he didn't even know who she was. When confronted with the video evidence of him leaving his residence, renting the Honda, and being spotted on camera withdrawing money from the ATM, Javier said that he found Valerie's debit card on the sidewalk when he was bar shopping in the East Village in Manhattan. But when investigators asked, "Well, how did you get the PIN?" he said, "Oh, I actually found her wallet on the sidewalk, and inside was a piece of paper with the PIN number written on it." I'm sorry, but who really expects that to be the truth? Who would even do that? It was an unbelievable scenario, and it was one after the next. In a search of his apartment, they found not only Valerie's driver's license but her bank card inside Javier's wallet. He also had her Kindle device and one of the pillows from her bed. Soon, they wouldn't need to listen to his lies because they had more evidence. They got his DNA and his GPS data, his phone extraction, in addition to Valerie's service provider's download, because they couldn't find her phone. This would show everything he did on his phone and everywhere he went, and what Valerie's phone was doing at the exact same time. First, they found that text from Valerie to her friend back in September 2018, saying she wanted nothing to do with Javier. From that moment on, there was no direct contact via phone between Javier and Valerie. But on January 24th, just days before she went missing, the same day she broke things off with Justin, Javier sent a very strange text to a woman he had been dating at the time. Now, I could not quite piece together what he was trying to convey in this text. The text was this: "I just found my ex effing in my bed with the guy next door in New Rel on December after years, but I didn't want to tell you." I don't know if it's the language barrier. I know his first language is Spanish, and maybe they translated this. I'm not sure, but he's mentioning an ex in reference to New Rel. And that's where Valerie lived. So detectives just assumed and pieced together that he was referring to Valerie. What he's essentially saying, I think, in this text, is that he somehow witnessed, I'm guessing his ex, which would be Valerie, having intercourse with her next-door neighbor. Since he used to live or be around that apartment, it seemed like he kind of considered it his. I don't know. That's how I interpreted it. I could be wrong. I didn't really understand, like on December after years, because it hadn't been years. They weren't together for years. Detectives assumed he was telling his new love interest that his ex had cheated on him in December and that he caught her. But we know that's not true. They weren't together, and they didn't date for years, so it's a little bit confusing. Most likely, this was just to garner sympathy from this new girl in his life. He had done the same thing with Valerie in the past, making her feel sorry for him. But 4 days later, on the exact night that Valerie told her mom and Jeffrey that she was scared someone was going to murder her, Javier left his apartment at 10:50 p.m., rented the Honda, and then input an address for a church in New Rel into Google Maps. Now we're getting this from his phone extraction, just so you know. Now that church is only 1 mile away from Valerie's apartment. Google location data showed Javier then traveled to New Rel a few minutes after midnight. Now, we're into January 29th. His GPS showed that he was within 200 feet of Valerie's apartment, at which point Javier decided to deliberately turn off the location services on his phone, which means he was not tracking his location anymore. However, the theory that Valerie knew he was there or that somehow they connected and she willingly let him in was debunked because there was no record of any contact made between these two devices prior to or after his arrival to New Rel. She had no idea that he was there. She wasn't expecting him, and he most likely broke into her apartment. Since he'd been there before, he knew an easy way inside. How was unclear, but what was apparent is that a violent struggle ensued in her bedroom at approximately 3 a.m. Now, 3 hours after Javier turned off his location data, his phone stopped pinging off cell towers, indicating that he had placed his phone in airplane mode. Isn't that interesting? Then this is disgusting. He used Valerie's thumbprint to unlock her phone. She was most likely unconscious at this time, and then he accessed her iCloud account. He viewed her Notes app, her photos. He went through her browsing history and the Find My iPhone app, so like all the places she had been, what she had been doing, and he did this until 4:17 a.m. So he is just sitting there going through her stuff for over an hour. At 4:20 a.m. and again at 4:33, Javier used Valerie's thumbprint again on her phone to access her Chase Bank application, and then he checked her bank account balance. At some point, he placed tape over Valerie's mouth, tied her up, and then put her inside a suitcase while she was still alive, and then placed that suitcase in the back of his vehicle. Just a half hour after he accessed her bank account from her phone, he went to the bank and was caught on camera withdrawing that $1,000 and driving westbound. Then, his phone location data was turned back on, and his phone pinged in Harrison, New York, at 6:29 a.m., then Darien, Connecticut, at 6:34 a.m., and then at approximately 7:11 a.m., Javier was once again accessing several different apps on Valerie's phone. By 7:24, his phone pinged on a cell tower in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is where Valerie's body was found. By 8:06, Javier's phone was traveling back the way he came. It pinged in Scarsdale, New York, New Rel at 8:27 a.m., and Queens, where he lived, at 9:11 a.m. Then, once again, he turned off his location services as he got closer to his own apartment, but CCTV footage showed him entering the building at 9:43 a.m., wearing that tan coat and carrying a duffel bag, and then exiting minutes later without it. Over the course of the next few days, he made a number of withdrawals that I briefly mentioned, totaling $5,350. On February 6th, the day after Valerie's body was found, Javier rented the same Honda CR-V in the early morning hours, and his phone GPS showed him going to a car wash in the Bronx. Then, he returned the vehicle to the rental company, clearly attempting to get rid of any evidence that Valerie had been inside that vehicle. The next day, on February 7th, this man callously logged into an online marketplace and traded Valerie's iPad for an Apple monitor and an Apple laptop, which he later told his roommate he found. He is so lucky that he finds wallets. He finds expensive electronics just lying around. Who needs to work when you have such good luck? Especially with the post that he made the next day, on February 8th, posing with his newly acquired technology, knowing that he killed for it. Was it worth it to trade a human life for material possessions? Days later, he's sitting in the interview room, lying through his teeth when they have enough evidence to prove he is responsible. When confronted with even more evidence, Javier still denied ever being in New Rochelle or Connecticut, but now he admitted that he did date Valerie. However, he hadn't seen her since the beginning of 2018. He claimed that everything was good in their relationship and it ended on good terms, even adding that it was so weird that his favorite thing about her was that she smelled good. Yet, he couldn't remember how long they dated. He was like, we didn't have an anniversary, so that meant maybe they didn't date even 6 months, right? But when they showed him text messages and the phone data of him being in New Rochelle and driving to Connecticut, he admitted he rented the Honda on January 28th. But he drank a lot that night and he blacked out. He didn't remember anything that happened. Finally, the detective showed him a picture of Valerie's deceased and partially decomposed body, and he began to break. In these pictures, she definitely didn't look the same way she had before he had done this to her when he threw her away like trash and left her to die. Now Javier was claiming he was with Valerie on the night of the 28th, and that her death was a complete accident, that it actually happened while the two were having intercourse. Of course, they want him to elaborate because they already knew this wasn't adding up. They knew she wanted nothing to do with him. They hadn't made any plans to meet up. They hadn't had contact in a long time. She wouldn't have let him inside willingly on a night that she had a terrible gut feeling. She was terrified she was going to be murdered. But they let him tell his version of what happened, and when asked how she died, he replied, "She fell. We fell together." When detectives asked if Valerie fell off the bed, he nodded and explained she fell on the floor, cracked her head open while they were getting a little rough while hooking up. He said he tried to help her, but she wasn't responding. At that point in the interview, he began to cry. He was shaking. He was shaking so hard he was having trouble speaking. But he told them that he put his mouth on her mouth. He tried to put air in it, and then when asked if Valerie was bleeding, Javier could only whimper. That's when he said, "I'm a bad person. I did something wrong. I didn't call the police because I thought they would blame me." So instead, you're telling me that instead of just calling 911, he taped her mouth so she couldn't scream or breathe, and then tied her up? According to him, when they asked why he did that, she wouldn't fit inside the suitcase. But he did admit that he drove. He didn't know where he was going, and after he got rid of her body, he went back to his apartment and waited, acting as though he knew that he was eventually going to get caught. Really, the fact that he was in Valerie's apartment for at least 3 hours means he probably attempted to clean up. That's probably why there was only a small amount of blood found. So, it seemed more like he was trying to get away with it. He nodded yes when asked if he knew that cops would find him. He even claimed that the reason he withdrew the cash from Valerie's account was because he wanted to get caught. Of course, the investigators did not believe the story. I mean, there was way too much premeditation for this to have been an accident. But let's say that it was. Let's say he was only there to steal her bank card. See, if the death was an accident, why not just call 911 to help this young woman who was still alive? But he put her inside of a suitcase. She would have most likely survived the head trauma. She died from suffocation. At this point, he was being charged with a federal crime of kidnapping resulting in death, a charge that carried the death penalty. This was because the federal government had jurisdiction. He kidnapped Valerie in one state and then crossed state lines, and she died in another. On February 12th, the same day that Javier was arrested, Valerie's funeral was taking place. It was at St. Gabriel's Church, while the captain was holding a press conference. I will narrate it to you as follows. Ever since Valerie Reyes was found deceased in Greenwich on February 5th, Greenwich police have been working closely with police from New Rochelle, New York. Several crime scenes have been examined, hours of surveillance video have been reviewed, and numerous interviews conducted. Detectives from both agencies have pursued a multitude of leads. There's been an intense focus on the use of Valerie's ATM card, after which we believe she was murdered. This line of investigation, corroborated by others, led us to a suspect last night in Queens, New York. Detectives from New Rochelle, accompanied by detectives from the Greenwich Police Department, located and arrested a suspect in the fraudulent use of Valerie's ATM card. This same suspect was interviewed jointly by Greenwich and New Rochelle detectives and admitted a role in the death of Valerie Reyes. The suspect, who has already been identified by New Rochelle police, is Javier de Silva of Queens, New York. At this point, Mr. D is the only one that's been identified as a suspect, but I want to emphasize that the investigation continues. The investigation is not finished yet. There are a lot of loose ends that need to be tied up. During the interview, he agreed to be interviewed, and I would characterize the essence as cooperative. Again, we just want to emphasize that we hope this obtains some level of justice. Back at the church, mourners came out to pay tribute to a life lost way too soon. In the hallway of the chapel, a video collage of Valerie's life played on repeat, capturing moments from her childhood, her singing, performing in a family play, sitting on the edge of a mountain in Colorado, and dancing with friends. The video also showed her playful side, featuring clips with humorous Snapchat filters and photos showcasing what her mother lovingly called her fashionista hairstyles. Her younger brothers, who are only 5 and 7 years old, were crying as they watched that video. Valerie's best friend, Jeff and Ricky Medina, did their best to comfort the heartbroken boys. Valerie was buried at Greenwood Union Cemetery, and her loved ones, including her mom and her older brother, huddled together, just crying and embracing as her casket was lowered into the ground. Her friend Andrea actually made a public statement about the person Valerie was. She was so alive. She would do a lot of things for the community. She was so sweet, and everyone remembers her as a very kind-hearted young lady. Her grandpa also said a few words as well. "We can't stand the pain, but we have to go on," says Reyes' grandfather. Days after being charged, Javier was already doing interviews with different news agencies, claiming that this was all a very unfortunate accident and that he was so spooked he ran and didn't call the police. He would sob, and he would act like he was so remorseful during these interviews, acting like he wished he would have done more to save Valerie, when it's so beyond clear that this was all on purpose. Let's be real. This man rented a car, turned his GPS off on his phone, and caught Valerie off guard because they had no plans to meet. She wanted nothing to do with him. He had already stolen from her in the past. So whether he went there with the intent to murder her or not, or just solely to steal, an altercation occurred because of it, and it ended in her death. Therefore, it makes no difference. His actions were intentional. When the DNA results came back, it proved that he also forced himself on her. Yep, so the plot thickens. His DNA was found on a vaginal swab, a swab of her chest, and underneath her fingernails. She fought back, indicating that this was not consensual at all. His DNA was also found on the handle of the suitcase. But I also want to mention this. When he was interviewed, he had a bruise under his left eye that was healing. She hit him. We know that she hit him. So she was fighting him. 4 days before this, he sent a text about being upset that his ex was sleeping with somebody else. How would he have known that? Because he was probably stalking her. This case started to appear to be about Javier taking what he wanted, Valerie's body on his terms, and her money. Whether he intended to kill her that night, or a struggle ensued as he tried to force himself and she resisted, she was dead because of him. He was only upset that he got caught. I can tell you that in total, he stole more than $10,000 from her bank account from September 2018 and the days following her death. When her ex-boyfriend, Justin Ort, heard about Javier being arrested, he said that it came as a huge surprise. He said Valerie did not speak of Javier recently, and she never said she was afraid of him either. Justin also mentioned he didn't know Javier was even in New York anymore. He thought he had moved to California. They came here to actually tell us that they have someone in custody, and then they released his name. My heart dropped. It's like emotions of so much anger and hate, but relieved, just thankful. Just thanking my daughter. I would ask her, I would pray to her every single night to guide them, to lead them to any evidence that might lead to his whereabouts. I know a lot of people are going to be relieved knowing that there's this monster, that they caught him already, that they made an arrest on the same day as your daughter's wake. What does that mean to you exactly? It means a lot. It means a lot. You know, it's different when your child dies of natural diseases, but when somebody, a monster, comes and takes your daughter away, or your child away, for what? For what? It's not only hurt, it's hate. So I feel relieved because they have him, but of course we're still obviously devastated. This case took quite a while to reach trial, mostly because it had to be handled in a federal court since the crime spanned 2 states. Additionally, a lot of the delay was due to Javier's defense team. They were repeatedly attempting to negotiate a plea deal. They wanted to remove the death penalty as an option. His public defenders, Mark DeMarco and Jason Schur, worked to reduce Javier's potential sentence by trying to portray him as a good person with no prior criminal history and a positive reputation among those who knew him. Really, they did this by emphasizing that he had been forced to leave college and flee Venezuela with only $600 in cash, seeking a new life in the US. While here, his defense said that he kept a low profile, working hard and being a law-abiding citizen. But I have to say, are we calling it a low profile? Is that what you want to call it? He was actually here illegally, and that's why he was laying low. But anyway, a year later, on the 5th of February, 2020, Javier appeared in court for the very first time. This date was exactly 1 year after Valerie's body had been found on the side of the road. And Javier looked very different from the man who had been taken into custody a year earlier. His hair was neatly cut, his beard was shaved. It gave him more of a clean-cut appearance, which is not uncommon when you're dealing with someone this nasty and evil, because you want to make them look nice, not disheveled or anything. He accepted a plea agreement, which required him to plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for the removal of the death penalty. In a statement provided to the court, Javier said in Spanish, "After a violent struggle in her apartment while Valerie Reyes was still alive, I bound her feet and hands, put tape over her mouth, and put her in a suitcase." 3 months later, he appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. Now this part of the proceeding is where the defense team can plead for leniency, and friends and family of the victim can share their impact statements. Then it's kind of balanced and weighed by a judge, and they decide what the sentence is going to be. Although his attorneys didn't try to diminish the seriousness of the crime, they attempted to argue that his violent actions were a result of, wait for it, intense stress, compounded by such a long time being separated from his family and his drug habit. He was habitually using marijuana. Last time I checked though, I'm just saying, I don't think marijuana is usually related to violence per se. I usually think it makes people more calm. They also just described him as a broken man that was sincerely regretful for his actions and fully aware of the horrific nature of what he had done. When it was Valerie's mom, Norma's turn to address the court, she spoke to Javier directly, saying that he was selfish, greedy, and a soulless person. She said, "You, Javier, deserve nothing but pain and rejection. A mother can never prepare to face a terrible day like this. I want you to hear the words of a mother who is devastated by taking away my baby girl. My boys are all heartbroken and devastated. My boys struggle to accept she's no longer here. Today, I hope Valerie finds the justice she deserves." Javier was also given the opportunity to provide a statement, and I was surprised he did. He said, "No words can express how repulsed I am by the acts I committed. My acts caused Valerie's death, and I can never forgive myself for doing that. It's my fault that she's not here any longer. Valerie's family deserves to know I'm sorry. I implore before God on my knees that God will bless them and remove some of their pain." The federal court judge, Vincent Bashidi, called it a brutal, callous, cruel crime, and he didn't buy the defense's claims that Javier was a good person who just did one bad thing. I mean, this is a very big bad thing to be just like one bad thing you did. He didn't believe that he was remorseful, and it didn't excuse his actions. Nonetheless, he didn't deserve a lighter sentence. The judge said that what you did to this woman was sickening. Anyone who could do such a thing is not a good person by definition. Anyone who could do such a thing like this is an evil person, and justice required an evil deed to be punished by a lengthy prison sentence. He also highlighted Javier's actions after the murder and how he stole from her bank account. Still, he sold her iPad for money, and he also made sure to mention that Javier's family could visit him in prison if he wanted them to. But Valerie's family would never get to see her again. So ultimately, he sentenced Javier to 30 years in prison, plus 2 years of supervision. He would be 55 years old upon release, which I think is not enough time. But immigration officials said that as soon as that man served his sentence, he would be deported. We've never gotten an answer as to what made Valerie so scared for her life in the days before her death. No threats were found on her phone or within any of her personal belongings, and if there were, they've never been reported. So, did Javier threaten her? Or is there a more mysterious explanation for her fears? Valerie was known as a deeply intuitive person, someone who often trusted her gut feelings. So did she sense that danger was near, maybe picking up on subtle cues that others may have missed? Was this a chilling premonition or a lingering sense of dread from a recent encounter? We'll likely never know the answer. Either way, this is yet another case where a woman's life has been stolen for a man's pleasure, whether that's the physical part or the material possessions that he stood to gain. At times, we encounter cases so wicked and distorted that they are incomprehensible to those of us who possess compassion, love, and a moral compass. Yet there exist individuals among us who appear to be devoid of any semblance of humanity. This is one such tale. It will prompt you to ponder the reasons behind such actions and whether it is possible to truly know anyone, as some individuals possess profoundly malevolent intentions. Let me introduce you to Sarah Louise Cafferkey. She was born on June 20th, 1990, to her mother, Noelle Dixon, and her father, Adrian Cafferkey, who met in the early 1980s. They ended up purchasing a home together in a close-knit rural community of Bacchus Marsh in Victoria, Australia. It's got a small-town feel where everyone knows everyone, and new faces definitely stand out in a crowd. This area is known for its fertile soil and extensive agricultural activities, particularly its orchards, market gardens, and vineyards. It's a suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia. Sarah grew up in a loving environment with close family and friends. But when she was only 9 months old, she and her parents relocated to Queensland, Australia, due to her father, Adrian, getting a new job. This was actually a 22-hour drive away, so it was quite a move from everything and everyone they knew. It's a much bigger area of Australia, with a coastline stretching nearly 4,400 miles. Things went well for about 2 years, but unfortunately the relationship between Sarah's parents began to fall apart. They decided to amicably separate, but remained on friendly terms for Sarah's sake. Sarah and her mom, Noelle, moved back to Bacchus Marsh, where Noelle had family and friends, providing a much better support system, especially when going through a separation and becoming a single mother. Sarah still saw her father on a regular basis. She and her mom, Noelle, would fly to Queensland so Sarah could visit and continue to have a strong relationship with her dad, Adrian. He would also fly out to see Sarah. When Sarah was about 5 or 6 years old, she began flying to Queensland by herself as an unaccompanied minor, making the trip at least a couple of times every year. Adrian said that Sarah would raise a person's spirit with just one glance, and he recalled that she once even shut down an airport. Yes, I explained that when she was traveling, she would go by herself. Well, when she was 12 years old, she heard a group of men talking, joking about some things that were prohibited by the airport. There's actually a sign near the security screening point that said they take jokes about terrorism very seriously. Sarah's family referred to this sign as the Sarah sign after this trip because Sarah reported those men and all the flights were stopped. All the planes were grounded. This just goes to show you that Sarah took safety very seriously, and she spoke up when she thought something was wrong, even at such a young age. Her father said that Sarah, quote, always spoke up strongly for things she believed in, for friends and other issues. She was a true giver and always there for people. She felt deeply the pain of others, end quote. Of course, Sarah had a fun side as well. She was bright and bubbly, and she was known to have a great personality. She loved poetry, writing, and she was a friend to everyone she met. She also loved anything pink and fluffy. Sarah's mom, Noelle, did not actually go on to have any more children because she was already close to 30 when she had Sarah. So she said that was it. That was all she was going to do. Sarah grew up as an only child, getting all of her mother's attention, and they were very close. Sarah had big green eyes and golden blonde hair. As a child, she was very loving, and she and Noelle did everything together. She was Noelle's life, and it was just the two of them for a very long time. The mother and daughter were companions, confidants, and best friends. As a child, Sarah attended Chi Primary School in B.S. Marsh until she was in the 10th grade. This is a very small rural school. They engage in a lot of outdoor activities and hands-on learning. Their website says they aim to develop students who are happy, optimistic, and confident in their community. The core values are responsibility, fairness, honesty, self-discipline, cooperation, and respect. After this, Sarah went on to attend secondary school at Bacchus Marsh Grammar School. Now this is what we in the US would refer to as high school. This was a private high school in her area, and throughout her adolescence, Sarah was very academic and athletic. She did martial arts, running, the high jump, and she even sang with the Australian Youth Choir, which is a pretty big deal because you need to try out to get a spot there. Sarah met one of her best friends at this time, Ashley, in 7th grade at a camp at the beginning of the school year, where students would get to know one another. Sarah went right up to Ashley and asked her if she wanted to be in her cabin. That's just the way Sarah was. She was outgoing, friendly, and she made sure other people around her were happy. From then on, the two of them were inseparable. Sarah also loved acting. She was a huge fan of the show Ally McBeal. If you've never seen it before, it's about a young attorney, played by Callista Flockhart, who joins a prestigious law firm, and the show follows the romantic and personal lives of the main characters. Well, this inspired Sarah to want to become a lawyer one day. It wasn't just that she was inspired. She had a goal to become a lawyer because she wanted to fight for others. She also dabbled a little in modeling and acting and considered going into that field as well. But then something happened that changed Sarah's teenage life. From a very young age, she always suffered from what was believed to be asthma. But in 2005, at 15 years old, when Sarah was in the 11th grade and now attending a new school, a public high school called Bacchus Marsh College, unfortunately, Sarah was officially diagnosed with acute severe bronchial spasms. This is a rare form of asthma. It's also known as bronchospasms, very uncomfortable contractions in the lungs that make it very difficult to breathe. The severity of someone's symptoms is actually related to how narrow the airways are, or how airflow is restricted, and in Sarah's case, they were very severe. She suffered from constant asthma attacks, some of which actually resulted in Sarah having to be hospitalized. Once an attack would occur, they didn't have much time to rush Sarah to the hospital. Many times, she would actually have to go by ambulance, and she also needed to be on daily medication. This caused her to miss a lot of school, especially in the 10th and 11th grade, and it also strained her relationships with her friends. She was in and out of the hospital, so she wasn't able to socialize as much as she wanted to. Her mom, Noelle, made the decision to finally homeschool Sarah in order for her to be able to complete the 12th grade and graduate from high school. This was very important to Sarah. She wanted to finish her studies because she wanted to work within the justice system as a lawyer, and she knew she would need strong academics going forward. At first, staying home from school may seem like fun to a teenager, and Sarah didn't let it get her down. She was known for her positivity, kindness, and generosity. Whenever she was up to it and not feeling ill, she would spend time with her friends and enjoy the outdoors whenever she was well enough. Sarah also loved animals, especially her family dog, a black Labrador named Sprocket. It was like her best friend. She was very attached to Sprocket, and they had quite a strong bond. However, over time, it seemed like the lack of social activities began getting to Sarah, and she rebelled, which is actually pretty common for teenagers. She was no longer interested in flying to go see her dad like she used to, because now she wanted to stay close to home and hang out with her friends. In 2006, around the age of 16, Sarah began experimenting with alcohol. Now this is not something her mother condoned or even allowed at home, but Sarah would obtain it from friends. Eventually, since she was very impressionable at that age, she began to experiment with other substances as well, including marijuana, ecstasy, and even GHB. If you don't know what GHB is, I don't really want to try saying the whole word, but I will try. It's short for gamma-hydroxybutyrate. It's a party drug that produces feelings of euphoria, confidence, relaxation, and sociability. It's kind of like a more intense feeling of being drunk from what I've read, and they call it liquid ecstasy. It's also been known. Now, the negative side effects of GHB can include drowsiness, vomiting, mood swings, dependence, as well as more serious symptoms like unconsciousness and respiratory collapse that could lead to a coma or, in extreme cases, death. And we already know that Sarah had a severe breathing problem, so of course, this was not good for her. Anyone, especially teenagers, can end up experimenting with substances, and I just try really hard and want you to try to not pass judgment on others too harshly, especially a teenager, because their mind isn't even fully developed until their mid-20s. Many times they're convinced by their friends to try things in order to be cool or be part of the friend group. Peer pressure is a real thing, so please give Sarah some grace. It is their choice, but usually the intention is just to have fun and nothing more. Unfortunately, many times, teenagers do become addicted and rely on drugs, going down a path they never intended. And, spoiler alert, this eventually does happen to Sarah. She was already going to therapy to deal with her emotions surrounding her asthma. So, once she confided in her therapist that she had been experimenting with substances, Sarah began receiving counseling for that as well. Despite this, she was using them frequently, and her mom noticed that her bright and bubbly girl was becoming withdrawn and moody. They already had so many other things causing mood swings, like hormones, so now adding this on top of it was a lot. Sarah was still trying her best to be productive. In between these bouts of sadness and darkness, she got a job. But then, unfortunately, the asthma attacks would come on, and no one knew what was going to trigger them, so it was hard to be consistent at anything. Not to mention that Sarah was not open with others about what she was going through, because she did not like telling anyone about her condition. She didn't want them to treat her any differently. She suffered in silence, and only her close friends and people very close to her, like family, knew what she was truly going through. Years went by, and as Sarah got older, she was still in therapy. Sadly, her dependence on substances as an escape continued, but she still dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Eventually, she enrolled to study social justice. By 2011, when Sarah was 21, she was also excited to get a job at a local pub in town called the Golden Fleece. For someone as beautiful, friendly, and outgoing as Sarah, it was the perfect fit. But it was right after Sarah turned 21 that things in her life got even worse. Enter Christopher Stewart. Sarah and Chris, who was a local guy, began hanging out regularly in September of that year, 2011, and eventually they started dating. At first, things were going really well. Chris seemed really sweet and caring. But about 2 months into the relationship, Noelle began seeing signs that Chris was not a good influence on her daughter. Sarah was not ready at that point to confide in her mom about what was really going on in her new relationship. But as it turns out, at some point, she did open up to her best friend, Ashley, and she told her that she was smoking a lot of weed and that things were not good with Chris. Then, eventually, in the months following, Noelle saw some very concerning text message exchanges between her daughter and Chris, where Chris was verbally toxic. He would send these very possessive and jealous messages, not letting Sarah go out with her friends or have any freedom. That's when Noelle confronted Sarah. At this point, not only did Sarah admit that things were bad with Chris, she also let her mom in on a very big and dark secret. Chris had introduced Sarah to a new drug, ice or crystal meth. Of course, this was shocking to learn. Any parent would be super concerned upon hearing that their child is taking an illicit drug, especially something like meth. It is a very addictive drug. For those not familiar with the drug, it looks like small, chunky, clear crystals, and that is why they call it ice. It's usually smoked, and when you do, you feel the effects almost immediately. It can also be injected, swallowed, or snorted. It's an upper like cocaine, but unlike drinking or doing coke or smoking pot, the effects of meth last for up to 12 hours. It's a stimulant. It makes people feel happy, confident, have increased energy, and decreased appetite. So it can be appealing to a person that likes to be thinner, but users also have an increased sex drive and euphoric feelings. So you can see it could be easy to become dependent on it. At first, all those things I just mentioned sound like positives, But obviously, there are many negative aspects of doing this drug as well. I think most of us know this, but even if people use it just once, they can experience paranoia, confusion, violence, and their bodies can even overheat. They can have seizures or even heart attacks, even if they're young and healthy. That doesn't happen to everyone, but everyone who does it has to come down afterward, which doesn't feel good. They feel exhausted, they can get headaches, and they can start hallucinating and feel itchy, and the list goes on and on. So they tend to chase another dose to get that feeling of all the happiness and the confidence and the energy once again, and not feel gross. This vicious cycle continues. So please again, be mindful that even though this is a choice, I encourage you not to judge Sarah too harshly. We all make mistakes. It doesn't make Sarah a bad person or stupid. Addiction affects all walks of life, all kinds of people. When Sarah told her mom about this, she acted like it wasn't a big deal. She said, "I have it under control." Since Sarah was not one to lie to Noelle, her mom believed her. Besides, there were no outward signs according to her mom that Sarah was out of control. There were no odd behaviors, and her mom said there were no physical signs. She looked the same, still as beautiful as ever. This is interesting, and it's a very important thing to note. It's not always evident by the way someone looks about what they're going through when it comes to drugs. It can happen fast, but it can also take years for those signs to show on the outside. What was evident was that Chris was bad news. He came from a troubled background filled with violence and drugs, and the friend group that he had introduced Sarah to were also regular drug users. It's hard to comprehend what someone like Sarah saw in Chris, but it might be as simple as recognizing a kindred spirit who was struggling to overcome their demons. But it didn't take long for the relationship to become problematic. Chris would systematically isolate Sarah from her friends and send her nasty text messages whenever she did something that he did not approve of. Not to mention, he was an addict, and Sarah was trying not to do drugs, but when emotions are involved, it is so much harder. Sarah desperately wanted to get clean, but she knew she would not be able to do that if she stayed in a relationship with Chris. So after she spoke to her mom, she promised she was going to break up with him and go to rehab. But ending things with someone like Chris is easier said than done. Sadly, this was the beginning of the end for Sarah, but she didn't have a clue what would end up happening. No one saw it coming, and even if you try to guess, you probably can't, because it's most likely not what you think is going to happen. But you'll know soon enough. When Sarah told Chris that things were over between them, of course, you could have guessed he got angry. He lashed out and told her that no one else was going to want her, that she was just a junkie, and that she was nothing without him. During a fight, he climbed onto the roof of their townhouse and threatened to throw himself off if she didn't take him back. People sometimes wonder why a woman will stay. Well, when you're kind-hearted like Sarah, you're usually the type of person a person like Chris will target, and then you fall in love. It's hard to watch someone that you love say they're gonna jump off of a building, even if they're not a good person or the best person to be with. Over the next few months, Sarah made every effort to move on with her life. She and Chris would break up, and then they would get back together again, and she kept falling back into her addiction. So over the next year or so, she knew that she would not be able to get clean without help, and Chris was still bothering her. She would still give in to him, and so many times people like Chris will use a person like Sarah's drug addiction to entice them to continue seeing them. This is evil, and it's sick. But they know the pull that the drug has on them, so they bait them into being with them again because of the, I'm gonna do air quotes, fun that they used to have together when they were high. This is a very typical scenario with these toxic drug-related relationships. The drug is now used as a tool so that Chris could try to get Sarah back. Well, finally, in August of 2012, at 22 years old, Sarah attended a detox program so that she could finally move on with her life. She really wanted to get back to her studies and away from drugs. Now, as part of her recovery, Sarah kept a diary of her time in the program, as she resided in room number 8 at the rehab center. So first, I want to read you a poem that she wrote about finding her way back to herself after addiction. It's titled, "Can I Have Her Back?" Now try to give it your undivided attention, because it's so well written, and I'm sure that we can all relate to it in one way or another. When you can say no, you don't want to, and when you want to say no, you can't. Believe me when I say that it's no measurement of the heart. You fake it till you make it in a lifestyle, an art. The only art surrounding your soul into the dark begins with blissful ignorance. You're blind to your own behavior, no sense of responsibility, and lack of human nature. Help us, like a child just waiting for a savior. A clouded, consistent state of mind replaced one wise and clear, abandoning her moral grounds with hopes of no more tears. As fearless as a coward, none of this feels right. Throwing so much energy into a self-destructive life, how did the darkness overwhelm such a beautiful, sparkling light? What happened to the little girl, so determined? Why not fight alone? Analytical and just too young to listen, her thoughts become possessive, and her life a demolition. What happened to that little girl with an amazing, contagious smile? Burdened by the world around, delusional and in denial, a specific date of when and why suddenly became irrelevant. The line has been crossed, it's a blur. It's now just for the hell of it. What happened to the motivation, the glimmer in her eye? A longing to escape reality with a forgetting sense of why. A compass pointing north with all senses screaming south, the constant battle in her head, looking to get out. Soul-searching, scorned by an insecure perspective, becoming more lost became her one and only objective. The world won't stop spinning for a poor, tortured soul. Shovel in hand, covered in dirt, she dug her own hole. Why can't she see the effects of her embrace? The power she had to put a smile on the sourest face? Why did she leave us and where did she go? With her presence still here but her soul. Now, not a minute more will I let her back down. Seriously, Sarah, can we have you back now? End quote. End of her entry. End of her poem. That could literally be a hit song, in my point of view, because it speaks to so much more than just addiction. We have all lost ourselves in something, and then we regret it at some point in our lives. And poor Sarah, I can feel her pain, and she's so intelligent. She is so well-spoken and so talented with words, and yet so lost. There were many entries in Sarah's rehab diary, 8 whole days, where she went into detail about her entire day, her thoughts and experiences. But I questioned a rehab that only lasts a week. I mean, I am not an expert, but I know enough about addiction to know that a month is usually a minimum amount of time that they recommend committing to kicking an addiction. And that's a minimum. With something as addictive and destructive as meth, I'd imagine that you need much longer. So a part of me felt like either Sarah was misinformed or naive, thinking that a week would change anything. Usually, the detox is a week, and then there's an intensive, extensive rehab mentally and psychologically. Once that's completed, our patient care continues, which consists of a person going to meetings every week, multiple times. The medical detox is just the beginning, and that is what that week is for. But Sarah probably thought she was strong. It's physical, it's psychological, and it's a mental illness. The withdrawals themselves are extremely dangerous and uncomfortable, and it's known to be a drug that's notoriously hard to quit because it destroys the dopamine receptors in the brain, making it hard for a person to experience pleasure on their own. And that's truly sad. This can lead to depression and then more of a craving for the drug, so it's a sick cycle. I looked on a website about addiction, and there's a minimum of a 2-month timeline for kicking an addiction to meth, and that's just the start. There's so much that goes into it, like a strong support system, getting away from the people who do it, even if they are friends, family, or your significant other. Getting rid of all the paraphernalia, exercising on a regular basis, and beginning more healthy behaviors to replace the toxic ones, building hobbies so that you don't crave it. Sarah probably went in thinking that maybe if she could physically get clean, get it out of her system, then she would be strong enough to stay clean. Her first entry in her diary was very telling, and I'm going to read it because it's so important for me to let you know Sarah for who she was. Again, I will play some music so that you know it's a quote and an entry from her. She says, "Wow, so here I am in detox. It's hard to fathom how I got to this point. I guess that's the trouble with addiction. When you can say no, you don't want to, and then when you want to say no, you can't." That's a quote from a movie I watched a while ago, a movie that I had such a connection with. I could relate to the circumstances before they had even occurred in my life. I hate that this quote, along with all of my drug-related knowledge and experience, was stuffed deep into my subconscious as to feel no awareness of my situation. I was lost and seemingly wanting to stay lost. I'm so selfish and ungrateful for having such a bad lack of judgment. I am weak for surrendering my powerful, strong mind to a clouded conscience in order to escape reality. I know better. I am not weak. I am determined, strong-minded, and righteous. I am scared to learn. I am nothing more than a hypocrite. I'm afraid by the fact I was so blind to my behaviors. I hate that by being so ignorant, I came across as a know-it-all and, most annoyingly, a hypocrite. These are not the personality traits I want to define me. I understand and accept the extent of my drug addiction and substance abuse. I've manipulated friends, family, stolen, taken money, and many times gone out of my way to put myself around drugs. Realizing this disgusts me. I can't imagine the heartache of my friends and family who have no choice but to sit back and watch me destroy everything they've helped me create. I cannot describe the sorrow I feel for hurting those that I love. It disgusts me that I was so deeply addicted to drugs that I was oblivious to the world around me. Everyone was trying to help me. I am so ignorant. I hate the extremes I would make people go to just to try to get me to listen. I couldn't be more appreciative of the people around me and couldn't be more grateful for their efforts and the fact they are still here to support me today. It is not my turn to make the effort. I wish I had noticed the signs sooner. I now know what my situation is and where I stand. I am going to beat this. Drugs will no longer drive my life or cloud my perspective. I need and will take responsibility for my actions. I will push myself and strive to be the amazing, grounded, generous, selfless person I can be. I want to fix my wrongs. I want responsibility. I want to work for the things I want and need. I'm going to return the favors to every single individual who I've encountered on this journey. I aspire to be the generous, caring person I once was. I respect all the amazing people in my life, and I need to show them that my actions will speak louder than my words, positively as opposed to the past. I will change. I will be me again. I will love again, myself and life. That's the end of that first entry in Sarah's rehab diary. You can see she's a very determined woman. She knew what she wanted, she regretted her actions, and she had a clear plan in mind for her life. I read all of her daily entries for that week. She started out scared and uneasy. She even had to be prescribed 3 Valium just to get through her detox in addition to her other medications. But by day 2, she had gotten some good sleep and was less afraid, but more aware of her situation than ever before. She was paranoid and began speaking with a drug counselor. She still had to take 2 Valium that day, and she realized she needed to address some underlying anxiety issues. She also realized that taking Valium wasn't the solution because all it did was make her sleep and not deal with anything. By day 3, Sarah only had 1 Valium because she really couldn't relax. Remember, she's going through massive withdrawal symptoms. But she said that day was a game changer for her. For the rest of the day, she did not use any more Valium and she was able to stay focused. This made her more shocked at the realization of her circumstances. She started to finally come out of her shell a bit, and she was ready for the long journey that she knew she would have to go on to truly move forward in life. She said, "Today, I poked my head out of my shell to realize it is what it is, and I'm now ready to move forward with my life. I understand this will be a long journey, and I will face so many bumps, distractions, and temptations along the way. The outcome, though, is very simple. I know how to do the right thing. It really is as simple as just doing so. P.S. I looked into the mirror today and for the first time in ages I saw the sparkle of my soul in my eyes. That meant a lot to me." On day 4, Sarah's mother, Noelle, came to visit her. At first, she was really happy about that, but then Sarah realized she couldn't let that be the highlight of her day because she didn't want to rely on others for her happiness. As she thought about it for a moment, she realized she missed her dog, Sprocket, a lot, and kind of expected to see her. But then she understood that dogs probably weren't allowed in a hospital setting. By day 5, Sarah was homesick. She woke up feeling grumpy, and she just wanted to go home. But her mood changed when her cousin Emma came to visit. She was so grateful because she knew how busy Emma was, but she took the time to come visit her and brought along with her a special doll that was supposed to be good luck. It was the same doll that Emma brought to the hospital when family members were ill, hoping it would help, and Sarah said it really did. It changed the way the room felt. She described it as peaceful bliss. Her mom also made a little surprise visit that day, and she was so grateful to have family by her side. She even ended up getting a workout in that day, which made her feel really good and motivated. She woke up the next day and said she had a grouse sleep. I had no idea what this word meant. Grouse is an Australian and New Zealand slang term that means something is excellent, great, outstanding, or very good. Then on day 6, Sarah said she felt good. It was the most normal she had felt. Her entry that day was long. She also said that day she received the most gorgeous bunch of flowers from her dad. She wrote, "Warmth fills my heart as I look at the beautiful array of blooms and take in the message, symbol, and meaning behind the flowers. I love you, Dad. Your thoughts have empowered me to stay focused. This small symbol of gratitude has given me an overwhelming feeling of never ever wanting to look back. I won't look back, just as I tell you not to look down. I love you, Dad." I'm sure that he cherishes those words even today. I know that I would. That night, Sarah was bored. She was bored doing all this soul-searching and analyzing her past. She just wanted to go home. She said that there was nothing else to do except put her words into action. By day 7, Sarah was feeling more like herself. According to her journal, she started getting into yoga, which she said she may have found her new exercise of choice. She found it very relaxing. That day, her cousin Emma came by again, but Sarah was also visited by a woman named Jane, who was on a mission to educate the public about meth and help addicts. She said they chatted for nearly 2 hours, and Sarah wrote about this experience. She said, "Not only did she want to hear my story and give me great words of advice, she extended me the offer to join her on this mission. I couldn't be more excited by the thought that my bad experiences and lessons learned could be used to help others. I'm very motivated to ensure that when I leave here tomorrow, I will never, ever, ever turn back to drugs to escape life. I want to live my life to the fullest of my ability and use what I've learned to help others see there is so much more to life than drug addiction. I need to help others see they have a meaning on this earth, and their life too is worth living to their full extent. I want you to remember what Sarah said, that she couldn't be more excited by the thought that her bad experiences and lessons could be used to help others. Take that to heart." Sarah also made that promise to herself to never, never turn back to drugs. I wish she could have lived in that moment forever, in that safe place within the 4 walls of that room in rehab. But she had to go back to the real world. By the next day she was leaving. On day 8, Sarah started her entry by writing, "Fully fledged, free female." She was ready to go home, and she was high on life, waiting for her mom to come pick her up. She even wrote thank you notes for the entire staff. She agreed to a weekly urine test and said in her final entry that she wasn't bothered by doing this. She understood it was just a routine part of rehab, and she had no intention of relapsing. However, she believed the rehab center expected her to. She said, "Others are just being realistic. Having dealt with drug addicts in the past though, with me, I truly feel there is no turning back. I think I'm coping pretty well with having to constantly explain my perspective, only to receive a look of willful doubt in my listeners' eyes. I get this. I understand it's all been said before, and I only know how I feel inside. I will be patient with people as they have been with me." So clearly what she's feeling is that everyone thinks she's going to go right back to doing drugs, and she's trying to tell them, "Look, I don't know. Maybe it's true I will, but in my mind I feel like I'm going to do this. I'm not going to turn back." She's going to try to be patient when people look at her like, "Yeah, no, once an addict, always an addict." She went on to say she was finally free from her roommate, and she had this unfamiliar energy pulsing through her body. But she realized it was from not being on Valium and not being stoned like she had been every day for the past 4 years. But this new energy made her mom question whether she was on something when she came to get her, and that disappointed Sarah. She understood her mom questioning her. but she hated that it was going to be hard for Noelle to trust her. However, she understood it may take a long time to earn that trust back. She was willing to be patient, and in the meanwhile, productive. When she got home, Sarah started to play with her dog, Sprocket, which she referred to as her beautiful baby girl, and called her school so she could resume her pre-legal studies in social justice. She also looked for a job. She ended that final entry with, "Can't wait to wake up tomorrow and see what this new day has to bring." That enthusiasm is contagious, but dare I say it's usually short-lived. It's common for a person who accomplishes something to feel this newfound confidence, but soon they fall back into the normalcy of life, and they become complacent once again. Sarah did get a job as a bar and gaming attendant at a hotel in Melton, about 15 minutes away from her home in Bacchus Marsh, and things seemed to be going well. But she and Chris got back in contact, and they ended up hanging out with each other following her week in rehab. I hate to say this, but I think you already know. Sarah relapsed just a month after she'd gotten clean. It's like I know that this woman wanted to change. I know for a fact, reading her words, those were her words. We know what was in her mind and heart, so I hate addiction so much. But the tendrils of her past relationship with Chris still lingered. While she was working on herself, he was working on trying to pull her back into his toxic orbit. And there's nothing that upsets a possessive man more than seeing their ex living their best life. So when Chris realized that Sarah wasn't just happy without him, that she was actually thriving, he decided to take her down a few notches. She again confided in her mom about backsliding, but once again, she committed to getting back on track. Eventually, the relationship with Chris finally ended in late October, and Sarah was planning on re-entering the detox facility and trying again with Chris out of her life. But he would not let her go. Instead, in September, Chris began stalking Sarah, but not in person. He enlisted the help of a friend to do his dirty work for him, a guy named Steven. Now, Chris told Steven he needed to teach his ex a lesson. He asked Steven to go visit her while she was working, and threatened that if she didn't get back together with Chris, something bad would happen to her and her family. How did he think that that would actually work? It's not really that romantic. It's pretty disgusting. But Chris's plan to have Sarah intimidated went haywire when Steven walked in and saw Sarah. First of all, she was strikingly beautiful, but beyond that, Sarah was a genuinely nice human being. As Steven sat and watched Sarah at work, he realized he couldn't work up the nerve to be cruel to her. Instead, he struck up a conversation with her, and instead of scaring Sarah and forcing her to run back to Chris, Steven told her that she needed to stay far away from Chris. He was bad news. Sarah had actually seen Steven before. He'd been part of the same circle of friends that she and Chris hung out with, but he was more of an acquaintance. If he wanted to, Steven could look pretty scary. He was fully tattooed, tall, muscular, and much older than Sarah. He was 47, and she was 22. But this also made him much more mature than Chris, and he felt like he could impart some fatherly advice to Sarah. So that's what he did. Sarah was grateful, and she kept in touch with Steven by adding him on her Facebook. He could relate to her breakup because he had recently experienced one himself, and soon the two of them formed a platonic friendship. You see, Sarah couldn't confide in many people about what she was going through, but Steven didn't judge her, and she also appreciated the fact that she felt safe around Steven. He didn't try to control her like Chris did, and rather than threaten to hurt her, he promised to protect her. Steven assured Sarah that nothing bad would happen if he was around, so if she ever needed anything, she just had to let him know. As they kept in touch, they met up in their common friend group. They mostly spent their weekends getting together and drinking and partying with friends. Steven's home was a safe place where Chris couldn't hurt her or bother her, so Sarah and her friends ended up going over to Steven's and hanging out. Sarah and Steven also bonded over their shared love of animals. Steven's Facebook page was filled with his posts sharing his love for his tiny little golden chihuahua, who he affectionately referred to as his baby girl. I saw so many cute posts he made about this little chihuahua. One said, "Playing with my baby before work and wondering how I can possibly leave her for a 3-day rock climbing trip next weekend." Another one said, "Thinking of my baby all day, So good to get home for cuddles. They say it's puppy love. It really is. So, in the early days of November, things between Chris, Stephen, and Sarah had actually reached a breaking point. Ever since Stephen told Sarah that her ex had asked him to intimidate her, the men were at each other's throats over their different perspectives of Sarah and the fact that Stephen had made friends with her instead of threatening her. Chris's plan had backfired on him, and now Chris wanted Sarah back, but she didn't want to be with him after everything he put her through. The thing is, Sarah was a kind person who wanted to see the best in Chris, and yet he showed his true colors every single time she would post anything about her new lease on life, or when she would put pictures up of her hanging out with her friends, especially if Stephen was there. Chris would reply with vile comments about her being a junkie or some other derogatory comment. She was very sensitive about anyone referring to her as a junkie. That was something that really bothered Sarah. It was something that really got under her skin because she was trying hard not to be. Sarah even had to explain to Chris that she didn't want to be with Stephen. It's true, at least not in a romantic way. He was 25 years older than her, and she saw him as a father figure. But Chris wasn't having any of it. This put her right between the two men, and even though she told her friends she would never go back to Chris, it was looking like her feelings toward him were softening, and he was working his way back in once again. But then, on November 4th, Sarah posted a picture of herself eating one of those big swirly rainbow lollipops on Facebook. Okay, it could be looked at as sexual, but Sarah didn't see it that way. She was just trying to be cute. Well, when Chris saw this picture and then read the comments, he was furious, especially when he saw that Stephen was being kind towards Sarah and maybe even flirting with her. Stephen commented saying, "Love the pic. Good-looking heartbreaker, LOL." To which Sarah responded, Hey, miss your presence, pal," with a smiley face. Now Stephen commented back with, "Catch up when you got free time. There better be a beverage handy, LOL, mate." In this thread, it appears as though Chris may have commented something back, but then it was deleted. However, Sarah's response is still there. She said, "Unlike the way your mind works, not everyone else operates on a sexual basis. Mature people of the opposite sexes are able to have a friendship based on genuine interest and care for each other. Stop being immature over Facebook, please. I've had enough. I will delete you if you're unable to be civil." Now I think that was in reference to Chris, because right under that, Steph comments and says, "Hey Chris, you're a funny guy." So clearly there is animosity between these men, sort of like Stephen had broken bro code and sided with Sarah, and Chris was pissed. Sarah still had plans to re-enter rehab on November 12th, especially after her boss at the hotel she was working at fired her on November 8th for being unreliable. However, they did say she could come back and get rehired if she could get her life together. That was her plan. Instead, her life was going to end, and Sarah had no idea the evil lurking behind smiles, empty promises, and fake pretenses, which is truly frightening. With Sarah's mother's help, she was able to secure a spot for treatment in that same detox facility. Since she knew she was going to be readmitted to that facility on Monday, November 12th, she wanted to have fun, relax, hang out with some friends, and visit before having to go to detox again. I kinda likened it to starting a diet. You know that you're gonna eat right and work out, so before you do, you just have that one final big cheat meal to get it out of your system. I feel like that is what Sarah figured she would do that weekend before she was set to begin her journey of getting clean again. Well, over the next couple of days while anticipating her return to rehab, Sarah hung out with her friends. She spent the night at their homes and went out to bars, having a good time. By Friday, November 9th, Sarah was back at home and back to Marsh and Sarah's normal routine on weekends, which was to usually go out on the town on Fridays. So her mom anticipated seeing Sarah dolled up that night and going out. But when she saw that Sarah wasn't dressed up for a night out, it appeared as though she was going to have a quiet night in. However, Noelle was going out that night, so before she left, she told Sarah she was leaving. Please make sure she cleaned up after herself and that she would see her later over the weekend. Now it's true, Sarah wasn't planning a night out on the town, but she had made plans to go over to her ex-boyfriend Chris's house. She wanted to discuss the breakdown of the relationship, And yes, I know what you might be thinking, and I was thinking it too. Why? Well, maybe for closure. Even Stephen had told her it wasn't a good idea, but Sarah had made up her mind, and she went. Now, it wasn't uncommon for Sarah to be gone over the weekend, spending the night with friends, but Noelle expected her to be back in time to get into that rehab on Monday. But Sarah didn't show up back at home, and that worried her. So she called her daughter again and again, but Sarah didn't answer. So, Noelle decided to reach out to Sarah's friends to ask if Sarah was over at their houses, but none of them answered either. At that point, Noelle, now distraught, it's Monday. Her daughter hasn't shown back up, and they were supposed to be in rehab setting her up for this other detox program. She decides to go straight down to the local Black Marsh police station and report Sarah missing. Noelle explained to a deputy that the last time she saw her 22-year-old daughter was on Friday night, and she hadn't heard from her since. Meanwhile, friends began receiving Noelle's messages that Sarah hadn't turned up over the weekend, and they thought that was really odd. So they began posting Sarah's picture all over social media, asking if anyone had seen her. That's when Sarah's best friend Ashley became aware that Sarah was missing. She saw Sarah's picture pop up on a Facebook post next to the caption that read, "Has anyone seen this girl?" Ashley was stunned, she was confused, and she thought to herself, is this a joke? But then she realized it wasn't, and she too tried reaching out to Sarah but got no answer. She was frustrated at this point. She texted Sarah saying, "You're scaring people. You need to come home. This isn't funny anymore." But she never got a reply. Not only was it out of character for Sarah not to keep in touch with her mother and her close friends, but she also required regular medications for her severe breathing issues, and those medications were still in Sarah's bedroom. It didn't take long for the media to get a hold of the story, and by Tuesday, a news report came out asking the public for help. Not only was Sarah missing and in need of her medication, her car, a silver 2001 Holden Astra sedan, was nowhere to be found either. Of course, Chris was one of the first people that police wanted to speak with, obviously since he was her most current partner. Noelle knew of her daughter's issues with him. Also, several friends and family members had shown the disturbing posts on Sarah's Facebook page from Chris to the police. Many of his comments were offensive, derogatory, and even threatened her. But when they tracked him down to interview him, he said that he hadn't seen Sarah since Friday. He explained that Sarah had dropped by his place on Friday evening to just talk, and that she left on good terms around 10 p.m., and he hasn't seen or spoken to her since. Well, that's kind of suspicious. If Noelle had seen Sarah before she left to go see Chris, he may have been the last person to see her before she went missing, because at this stage, no one knew when Sarah had truly disappeared. It could have been any time after her mom saw her. They couldn't immediately rule Chris out, even if he had an alibi, because they didn't know the timeline yet, so he remained a person of interest. As the investigation progressed, friends began coming forward with information about when they saw Sarah last. One of her girlfriends said that on Wednesday, November 7th, she and Sarah had gone over to Stephen's house to hang out, and she admitted that they did GHB and meth that night, ending up crashing over Stephen's. She also mentioned that Sarah told her that she felt like she was just a junkie, so it seemed like maybe Sarah's mental health had taken a hit. But we know that she was seen on November 9th by her mom, so they needed to keep digging. Police went to local businesses and asked them if they could pull up any surveillance footage, and that is when they got their first big break in this case. Sarah was spotted on CCTV on Saturday, November 10th, at a local Foodworks supermarket at 156 Piedmont Bennett Street in Bacchus Marsh. She could be seen buying some alcohol, and in this still shot, Sarah is smiling as a little girl walks right past her near the front entrance. She doesn't seem to be in any distress. She actually looks very happy. Sarah appears to be carrying a handbag and her keys in her right hand. She's wearing sandals, a maroon miniskirt, a colorful tank top, and a lavender jacket, with her hair pulled up in a bun. Of course, this information was distributed to the public along with the description of Sarah as a Caucasian female with a fair complexion, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a thin build, black shoulder-length straight hair, and green eyes. The days were passing, and everyone was worried. They were scouring through their text messages from Sarah, being their own detectives, and trying to piece together her last known whereabouts and her movements. That is when a business owner, David Bushell, came forward. He was the owner of Young and Main Hotel off of Young and Main Street in Bacchus Marsh. It's a well-known establishment that has pool tables, a bar, restaurant and event space, and a nice beer garden outside. He told authorities he saw Sarah there on Saturday afternoon. She was a regular, and he recognized her right away from the media. Nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. She was there with friends, just casually sitting in the beer garden, chatting with a number of people, and drinking before leaving with a man that she had arrived with earlier. They hadn't stayed very long, but everyone appeared to be getting along just fine. When asked for a description of the man that Sarah was seen leaving with, the owner said he was a bit older, muscular, and not someone he was familiar with, even though he had seen him there before. The timeline was starting to come together. Now they knew Sarah was accounted for late in the afternoon on Saturday, November 10th, and they had a description of a man that she left with, and it sounded a lot like Stephen. But of course, they didn't have his name yet. Instead, they asked friends and Sarah's mom if they had any information about this guy. Noelle said that Sarah had mentioned Stephen in the past, but she wasn't very familiar with him. All Noelle knew was that Sarah texted her saying, "If anything happens, Ally knows where he is and where he lives." Ally is one of Sarah's closest friends. When she was contacted by the police, Ally told them that Sarah had been hanging out with Stephen a lot recently, and she was even able to provide them with Stephen's phone number and point them to where Stephen's condo was in Bacchus Marsh. Police then texted Stephen, asking to speak with him. They also wanted to gather more information about when the last time he saw Sarah was. Nearly 24 hours after this text was sent, Stephen got in touch with them and left a message with the Bacchus Marsh Police Department. When they finally did speak to him, he said that he didn't know where Sarah was, that they did hang out on Saturday afternoon at the Young and Main pub. Then they walked back to his place, which is only about 500 feet away from the pub. He said they drank some alcohol, hung out for a bit, but then he had to take care of some business. He told Sarah he had to go, but she wanted to stay behind, so he gave her a set of spare house keys in case she needed to lock up, and he told her to text him later. Stephen didn't return until the next day, on Sunday, and Sarah wasn't there. She hadn't been responding to any of his calls or text messages. It was already pretty late that night when police actually spoke to Stephen, and he said he was home at the moment because he was actually in the middle of moving to a new residence in a place called Point Cook, which is about 45 minutes away. He was busy doing that, going back and forth and moving things, so officers just decided to go take a look at Stephen's condo nearby Bacchus Marsh. That was the last place he said he saw Sarah, so maybe there would be a clue to her whereabouts. They drove over to the multi-tenant building around midnight that night on Wednesday, November 14th, and they saw nothing out of the ordinary, except there was a dog that looked like he was in distress, alone inside the property, just barking over and over again. It was too dark for them to see anything through the windows, even with their flashlights, and it was too late to talk to neighbors. So the very next morning, on Thursday, November 15th, officers went out to the address that Stephen gave them to his new residence in Point Cook. Now this was a brand new development, very nice upscale homes, including the one Stephen was renting. They knocked on the door but got no answer, and again they saw nothing out of the ordinary. This time, they did get to speak to some neighbors who said they really didn't know the two men who had just recently moved in there. But one neighbor, Miss Sheth, who just moved into the subdivision 6 weeks ago herself, recalled hearing power tools late at night, maybe around 10 or 11 p.m. recently. When she looked over, she saw one of the men doing some mechanical work in the garage, and she said he was just doing stuff in the garage, nothing out of the ordinary. She even said, "I think he was just like a normal Aussie bloke." That's how she described him. So there's not much for police to suspect any foul play or anything like that, so they kind of ruled this as a dead end. However, later that evening, due to a tip from the public, Sarah's Ashra sedan was found on Owen Street in Marybarang. Now this is about a 45-minute drive away from Bacchus Marsh, so that was very peculiar. When the news that Sarah's car had been found made its rounds on social media, friends of hers started to post on her Facebook. One friend, named Jennifer, said, quote, "I've lost hours of sleep over the week. I've been so stressed and scared. My brain is in overdrive thinking. I've cried so many tears. I've watched and read more news segments than ever before in my life. I've never felt more helpless. All this because I care and love you. The girl I've known since the day I was born. The girl I know with a gorgeous smile and the bubbly, infectious personality. Please be okay, safe and well, and home with your family and friends soon." End quote. Another friend named Kat posted, quote, "I can't stop thinking about your gorgeous smile that always lights the room up. I just want to hear you're safe and okay. I love you, S-Bear." Quote. This was a name that her friends would affectionately call her. Everyone was trying to make sense of it all. There were no signs of a struggle related to her vehicle. However, it was discovered that it was parked outside of a known drug dealer's home. By now, police had also been told by those close to Sarah that Stephen was also a local dealer, and that was the reason Sarah's ex, Chris, even knew him to begin with. They weren't really friends, but rather acquaintances, and he was supplying Chris, Sarah, and their friends with meth, among other things. That was the main reason Sarah hung out at Stephen's, which does make perfect sense now why a 22-year-old would be hanging out with this 47-year-old man. So they began looking into Stephen a bit more, and they were trying to track him down. At this point, it seemed like he had vanished, which makes him look even more suspicious. They do label him a person of interest in Sarah's disappearance. Suspicion continues to swirl around Stephen, especially as the investigation moved out of the control of the local police department into the hands of the Victoria Police, specifically the Wyndham Crime Investigation Unit. Unbeknownst to the local police, this crime unit had been looking into reports of a drug ring that was operating out of both Bacchus Marsh and Point Cook, two places where Stephen Hunter lived, and his name kept coming up in the course of that drug investigation. So as soon as Sarah's case was handed over to them, he moved to the top of their list of persons of interest. They went back over to Stephen's condo in Bacchus Marsh to interview neighbors, and they spoke to two young girls who had been playing in the driveway near Stephen's home on the evening of Saturday, November 10th. They told police they heard a scream, a loud scream, and the sounds of pots and pans crashing to the ground. So at this point, a search warrant for this property was requested, and by Saturday, November 17th, that warrant was executed. Officers entered Stephen Simpson Street condo. Now, I'm going to do a short, succinct recap right here in case you might have been busy while you're listening and lost track of what's happening. These recaps exist in cases like this because there are so many names and so many places. So, here we go. If you want to skip it, just look below in the timeline right here for the chapter markers. Sarah Cafferkey was from a small suburb of Bacchus Marsh in Victoria, Australia. She grew up with her single mom, Noelle, after she and Sarah's father, Adrian, split up. Sarah was raised as the only child and was thriving, particularly in sports. She was attending a small private school and flying to Queensland to visit her father a couple of times each year. However, in 11th grade, things changed when Sarah's asthma began getting severe, and by age 15, she was diagnosed with bronchospasms, making it very hard for her to breathe. She was put on daily medications and was hospitalized a number of times, which made it impossible for her to keep up her grades. So she was eventually homeschooled by her mother, and that's when she unfortunately began to experiment with substances. This was a way she could escape from her condition and the depression and loneliness it brought. She connected with a new group of friends, but they were part of the bad crowd, and Sarah's mom noticed her bubbly personality shifted. She became more withdrawn and moody. But Sarah was still doing well over the next couple of years at work and studying in college classes to become a lawyer. That is until she met Christopher Stewart, who introduced her to meth. Sarah was hooked, and Chris was toxic. He kept her isolated from friends and sent her very nasty, controlling texts, which Sarah's mother saw. That's when Sarah confided in her mom that she needed help. Sarah checked into a rehab facility and successfully detoxed. She chose to leave after just a week with a renewed sense of confidence and a number of diary entries showcasing her desire to get her life back on track and continue working hard to achieve her dream of working in the legal field. But this was all short-lived, as Chris came back into Sarah's life and she began using meth again. But this time, with her knowledge of her addiction and that she could use detox to get clean again, she broke up with him. Chris was upset with this, so he sent his friend Steven, who was also his drug dealer, to go harass Sarah at work. But this plan backfired. Steven, being older than them at 47 years old, decided not to go along with the plan. Instead, he made friends with Sarah and warned her to stay away from Chris. Sarah felt safe around Steven. He was tall, muscular, and wise, kind of like a father figure. He took her under his wing and promised to protect her from Chris. Over the next couple of months, they formed a trusting platonic bond. He was one of the last people to see Sarah before she vanished after leaving her home on Saturday, November 10th. She was seen on CCTV footage at a supermarket buying alcohol, and then later in the afternoon, she was spotted with Steven at a pub down the street from Steven's condo, which is located on Simpson Street, a 5-minute walk from the pub. Steven admitted to police that he was with Sarah that afternoon, and that the last time he saw her, she was at his condo. They had a few drinks before he left to continue moving his things to his new home, 45 minutes away in Point Cook. He gave Sarah a spare key to his house and told her to keep in touch, but she hasn't responded to any of his messages. At this point, Steven became a person of interest because he seemed to have been the last person to see Sarah. He's also known to be a local drug dealer and had been supplying Sarah with meth. At this point, Steven's condo in Bacchus Marsh, where Sarah was supposedly last seen, is about to be searched. So here we go, we're back on track with the story. When officers searched the condo, they found obvious signs that something terrible had happened inside. However, it seemed like whoever was involved attempted to clean the walls and the floors, but they didn't do a very thorough job of it because blood was found in a lot of places. On the living room couch, a leather jacket, a pair of dumbbells in the garage, 2 bar stools that were also in the garage, a carving knife under a wooden cabinet in the bedroom, a pickaxe in the living room, and on a massaging device in the bedroom. In other words, there was blood everywhere, and this was not good at all. At this point, the homicide squad was called to the scene to collect and examine evidence, and Sarah's mother, Noelle, was notified about what was happening. Now, at the time, Sarah's mom just assumed that having homicide detectives on the case meant they were still looking for a missing person. But in reality, they were now looking for a deceased person, her deceased daughter, who was still nowhere to be found. 2 hours later, investigators entered Steven's new rental home, 45 minutes away in Point Cook, and as soon as they stepped foot inside, they smelled a foul smell of decay. They scoured the entire home, looking for the source of the smell, and once they got inside the attached garage, the smell got even stronger. That's when they located a green trash bin, where they believed the smell was emanating from. There were blood stains near this trash bin, but they were unable to lift the lid off. On the ground nearby were empty bags of ready-set concrete and garden lime. It was clear that the lid had been cemented shut, and they weren't even able to remove or move this bin because of its weight. Clearly, someone had mixed cement and poured it inside this bin along with lime. If you don't know, garden lime accelerates decomposition and reduces the smell of putrefaction. Lime can assist in destroying evidence of a crime. The investigators called on forensics to retrieve this bin, and the next day, on Sunday, November 18th, it was removed from the premises and taken to the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, where they actually had to X-ray it to determine whether their suspicions were true, that a body was inside. And sure enough, encased inside the cement at the bottom of this bin were the remains of a human being. Because of course they knew that this had to be Sarah. All the evidence pointed to this being her, and as you can imagine, so many thoughts were going through their minds as to how she ended up there. Now they had the difficult and heartbreaking task of breaking this news to Sarah's mom, Noelle. They came into her home, sat down on her living room couch, and said to her that they found Sarah. Noelle actually responded, "Oh, that's good," not aware of what they meant. The officers just stared at her and continued saying that Sarah was in concrete, Noelle just sat there, confused, and the officers went on to say that she was in a trash bin. Noelle wasn't able to process what she was hearing. In the back of her mind, she was still thinking they were letting her know that Sarah was okay. She was also very confused. It just wasn't clicking for her. Meanwhile, the news was reporting that a body had been found on the Point Cook premises, and more of Sarah's friends were being notified that the body was indeed Sarah. Her friend Ashley remembered getting that call from her father. He didn't even have to say more than, "It's her." And Ashley knew what that meant, that the body in the bin was Sarah. It was so devastating to realize that this was real, that Sarah was gone, and now a nationwide manhunt was underway for 47-year-old Stephen James Hunter. Coverage of the story was broadcast across TV, radio, and print media, and investigators began looking into this man's background to understand who Stephen really was. Wait until you hear this. It's exactly why this is part of another Evil Minds video. Stephen James Hunter was born on October 6, 1965, in Melbourne, Australia. He had an extremely dysfunctional childhood, which included him witnessing significant domestic altercations and being the target of physical altercations himself. These traumatic early experiences undoubtedly contributed to his development into an extremely violent and disturbed adult. It paints a picture of a very disturbing man who should never have been allowed to walk the streets freely. And yet, despite years of convictions, parole, and monitoring, Stephen was able to do just that. This is a case where the system didn't just let Stephen's victims down. It effectively handed them to him on a silver platter. As a young man, Stephen struggled with managing his anger. He couldn't sit still in class, and when something didn't go his way, he would lash out at whoever was near him. His violent tendencies actually began to surface as early as primary school, where he exhibited aggressive behavior towards his peers and even his teachers. The dysfunction at home only made this issue worse. There was no stability, no support, and there was no one interested in helping him manage his emotions effectively. By the time Stephen was a teenager, he had developed a concerning opinion of women. In his mind, they only existed purely to satisfy his sexual desires. This distorted perception, combined with his unresolved anger issues and his violent tendencies, became the foundation for the destructive and dangerous behaviors that would later define his life. At the age of 16, Stephen moved out so he could rent an apartment with his 15-year-old girlfriend. Moving out was the only way to ensure that this girl was completely under his control and available to him anytime that he wanted. But the relationship ended soon after they moved in together. However, Stephen's lust for sexual gratification and having his own way with women was only just getting warmed up. In 1983, he was convicted of burglary, theft, and criminal damage for breaking into a store and stealing a pair of gloves. Later that same year in October, Stephen was convicted of threatening someone with a deadly weapon. He was fined $800, and then a few months later, after getting into a fight over a girl who rejected him, he faced another conviction for unlawfully being on a premises and received another fine. For the next 2 years, Stephen appeared to turn his life around. He got into a relationship with a woman. They had a son together. Some reports actually said he was married to the woman, while others just said they were together but unmarried. Either way, Stephen was working 3 jobs to pay the rent on their mobile home they purchased at West Meadows Caravan Park, and he was doing his best to support his new family. In his spare time, Stephen even coached a girls' football team. And from the outside looking in, it seemed like he was finally leading a stable life and staying out. But beneath the surface, Stephen's violent tendencies and unresolved issues towards women kept going. Despite the outward appearance of a reformed life, he was a man on the edge. Stephen got less than 2 hours of sleep at night, and he was a heavy drinker. He also used to speed and use other drugs regularly to stay awake. So, with little sleep, the drug use, the alcohol, and the stress of maintaining the appearance as a changed man, it's no wonder that Stephen developed a very wicked temper. He began to dish out the same violence that he experienced as a child, particularly when he didn't get his way. No one was safe from Stephen, neither his partner, nor his child, nor his colleagues, and not even his friends. Stephen was on the edge of inevitable disaster. It was just a matter of time. When Stephen was 21 years old, he began working as an assistant manager at Safeway Hypermarket in Gladstone. One of his co-workers was an 18-year-old girl named Jacqueline Cecilia Matthews, who was in her final year of high school. She was a pretty, petite, vibrant, and outgoing young woman with a bright future. That was until she had the misfortune of crossing paths with Stephen Hunter. From the outset, Jacqueline knew that he was bad news. Stephen bluntly told her he wanted to sleep with her, and she told him she wasn't interested. Yet no matter how many times this woman said no, Stephen kept hitting on her and making inappropriate advances. In one incident, he pretended to fall over accidentally and land on top of her in the storeroom, trying to kiss her while she was trying to get out from underneath him. He also invited her to hang out time and time again, to go surfing and do things together, but she always turned him down. She told her friends what was happening at work and that she didn't want to date a man who had a child, but she didn't care for Stephen anyway. Meanwhile, Stephen was having conversations of his own about Jacqueline. He told a friend that ever since the storeroom incident, he couldn't stop thinking about her, and quote, now that he had a taste of her, he wouldn't stop until he finally got her. End quote. That is disgusting. And the tension between Jacqueline and Stephen came to a head on the 9th of April in 1986, when she turned him down for the last time. When she left work after her shift ended, Stephen ran out of the building after her car. Then, a couple of hours later, Stephen returned to work in a fresh set of clothing and wet hair. In the early hours of the following morning, the burnt-out remains of Jacqueline's vehicle were found at the Rendall Road Bridge facing the river. Her body was found, charred beyond recognition, and slumped in the back seat of this car, with a gasoline container nearby. Fire investigators determined that this vehicle had been doused in gasoline before it was set on fire, which made it clear it was an act of arson. Jacqueline's autopsy then revealed she had not even died in this fire. She had been stabbed 7 times in the throat and heart before her car was set on fire to cover up this crime. As the word spread about Jacqueline's murder, her friends, family members, and co-workers came forward to share their observations of Stephen's behavior towards her in the weeks prior, and he was quickly labeled a person of interest in her death and brought in for questioning. Investigators would later describe Stephen's attitude during these police investigations as unfazed and cold. He denied having any involvement in Jacqueline's murder and claimed he had been at work the whole time. He said, quote, "I'm not going to confess. We can play games all night." End quote. But Stephen's co-workers provided compelling statements that he had run out the door when she left that night. They recalled he was gone for several hours and then came back to work in a new set of clothing. Finally, the pressure was on. The evidence was mounting against Stephen. He decided to provide his version of the events leading up to Jacqueline's death. Stephen claimed that his car was blocked in at the supermarket, so Jacqueline offered to give him a ride home. But instead of going straight home, Jacqueline decided to drive the car to a place where she could park, and then she started to kiss him. The situation escalated, according to Stephen, when he got mad that Jacqueline wouldn't take him back to work. When he demanded to go back because he was married and didn't want to cheat on his wife, he said that he slapped Jacqueline. Then she pulled a knife on him and tried to attack him. They struggled inside the car, and she somehow ended up in the back seat, and then all of a sudden, she was bleeding to death from her stab wounds, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Stephen went on to say, quote, "I've got a violent temper. I just stabbed her. I went mad and stabbed her a few more times. I should have taken her to the hospital the first time, but I was scared." End quote. Stephen recalled that he was covered in blood, so he knew he needed to go home and change. He also knew he needed to return to work because he needed an alibi. But when he got home, his wife had people over, so he had to go wash the blood off outside and then cover himself with a blanket before going inside and changing. At some point, Stephen confessed to his wife that he had killed someone. Stephen even asked a friend to help him dispose of Jacqueline's body and the evidence left in her car. They doused the car in kerosene and set it on fire. Once the vehicle was fully consumed, the friend supposedly drove Stephen back to work, but not before he got rid of the knife by by throwing it in the trash. Stephen thought that the fire was enough to eliminate any potential connection between him and Jacqueline's murder. He went on with his life as if nothing had happened. However, because the investigators were closing in on them, the friend who helped him cover up Jacqueline's murder started to beg Stephen to come forward so that he would not be implicated in Stephen's crime. But when he refused, the friend went to the police and admitted everything about the cover-up. Finally, Stephen did confess, and in the end, he stated, quote, "I'm not a human being. I'm a dog. I want to go to jail for 20 years." End quote. If Stephen actually got what he asked for and what he deserved, endless heartbreak could have been avoided for both Jacqueline's family and his future victims. But instead, Stephen's lawyer urged him to plead not guilty to Jacqueline's murder, and the case was sent to trial. On the stand during the 1988 trial, Stephen presented an absurd defense. He claimed that Jacqueline had relentlessly pursued him. She was the one who tried to kiss him in the storeroom. She was the one who wouldn't let him go back to his wife when he said he didn't want to cheat. He was the one who repeatedly warned her that he wasn't interested in a relationship. Stephen claimed that Jacqueline had pulled a knife on him because he turned her down and he accidentally stabbed her. Quote, "I was frightened and I panicked, but I didn't mean to harm her. It's hard to believe I did this terrible thing." End quote. No, it's really easy to believe you did it because you're a monster. Thankfully, the jury was not convinced by this performance of his. It was clear to everyone that Jacqueline's murder was motivated by Stephen's unsatisfied lust and the rejection he felt. He was in a jealous rage in Jacqueline's car when she refused to engage with him. Stephen was found guilty of murder, and you would expect that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The judge even described Stephen as having shown no signs of guilt or any kind of remorse. But the judge ended up sentencing him to only 16 years in prison, with just a 13-year period before he could get parole. Of course, he criticized Stephen's characterization of what Jacqueline did, stating that Jacqueline was the predator. He said that the story of this deceased girl abducting you and getting you to a quiet place in order to make these advances upon you is absurd. But despite the brutality of Jacqueline's murder, the judge also expressed concern for Stephen's future. A future that his victims will never have. A future that Jacqueline would never get. In the judge's mind, 16 years was a long time in prison, which would limit Stephen's chances of doing much of anything, having a career, getting any job experience, being a father again. He said that Stephen would be a drain on this community for many, many years, with little to no chance of ever returning to the community as a useful or decent citizen. No truer words have ever been spoken. Yet, 13 years later, the same guy who so brutally took a life, admitted to a cover-up, and then tried to blame it on his victim was allowed to walk free. Free to cross paths with another unsuspecting woman. Sadly, Sarah had no idea who Stephen truly was. He wasn't a protector, he wasn't her savior, he was her worst nightmare. She would meet her violent end at his hands. What Sarah didn't know was that Stephen had spent the past 24 years in and out of prison. 4 years after murdering Jacqueline and burning her body in her own car, and 2 years into his jail sentence, he actually escaped from prison and was just given 4 additional months on his term. Just 4. After serving those mandatory 13 years of his 16-year sentence, he was released on parole. 2 years later, in March of 2002, he was at it again. He kidnapped someone, tied them up, gagged them, and beat them. When he was arrested for this, they found drugs on him, meth to be exact, and he was intending to sell them. So his parole was canceled, and he was sent back to prison in July of 2002. He should have stayed there. Yet 3 months after being sent back, he was re-released on parole again. Then, in February of 2005, Stephen was arrested again, charged with a DUI, and 2 months later, he finally faced justice for that kidnapping and beating of that man 3 years earlier. He was found guilty and sentenced to at least 4 years and 6 months in prison, but he appealed the sentence and it was reduced by 6 months. He was released on parole in late 2011 before meeting Sarah. I know that was a lot to take in, but the point is he was in and out of prison, being paroled again and again, given chance after chance. Now recall that towards the end of October 2012, after Sarah's first time in detox, she confessed to her mom that she was using again. Now she didn't reveal to her mother that she had a steady supply of drugs from her new friend Steven. Sarah never got the chance to turn her life around, because unbeknownst to her, on the 30th of October 2012, Steven's parole period ended and he was once again a completely free man. Instead of following Sarah's lead and turning his own life around, he used his freedom to destroy hers. As investigators were looking into Steven, they were able to retrieve both his and Sarah's phone records, including text messages that were sent and social media interactions between them. Steven had told friends he was not sexually attracted to Sarah. Well, also remember that on Wednesday, November 7th, Sarah and her friend went to Steven's to party and spent the night. Well, at 3:45 a.m., Steven sent Sarah a text that said, "I love you lots." He continued to send her similar texts throughout the afternoon and at night. This flurry of messages might have had something to do with the fact that Sarah told him she was going to see her ex, Chris, to talk about their breakup. By Saturday, the 10th of November, Sarah was just a few days away from checking back into detox. There were text messages between her and Steven from Saturday morning, showing them making plans to hang out at his condo on Simpson Street. Steven texted Sarah at 11:21 saying, "Just walked in the door at flat, come over if you're bored." About an hour later, Sarah texted back, "How long are you hanging at the flat for?" Steven responded, "Depends, really. Came back for a shower, which I'm about to jump. Then I was going to go chasing someone to play with. What you doing?" Sarah texted back a few minutes later at 12:27 p.m. saying, "Drinking Sparrow 'cause I'm feeling lonely. LOL. I'm down for a play. I'll get my face on and pop over." Steven said, "Excellent playtime it is." This may have been a code word. This whole playtime, someone to play with, playing, could have been a code word for meth. But either way, we know Sarah went to buy alcohol about an hour or so later, because that was caught on CCTV footage. Before she was seen for the very last time with Steven at that pub near his condo, and then never seen again. Once the painstaking task of removing Sarah's body from her cement tomb inside that trash bin had been concluded, her body was sent for an autopsy. She had been badly battered and stabbed at least 19 times in the head, chest, and abdomen. Meanwhile, the investigators were interviewing neighbors around Steven's Simpson Street condo about what they knew about the 47-year-old man. A woman named Marita, who lived next door to Steven for the last 18 months, said that he was pretty much a model neighbor. They would chat in their shared driveway on a regular basis, and he would run around with his cute chihuahua. Their most recent conversation was actually on Saturday, November 10th, when Sarah went missing. Marita actually saw Sarah arrive at Steven's with a friend that afternoon, and all three of them left together. But only Sarah came back with Steven later that evening. Knowing that Sarah had later been found murdered, Marita said that it was a tragedy, and she wished that she could have reached out and grabbed her, telling her to go. Marita confirmed she never saw Sarah leave Steven's condo that night. She also let investigators know that this wasn't the first time she had seen Sarah. She'd actually been coming to visit Steven for several weeks. Marita said Steven had many friends, most of whom were actually men, so Marita was surprised when this 22-year-old woman began visiting this 47-year-old man regularly. She said that for the last few weeks, Sarah had been coming there regularly, day and night, and she would say hi. On Saturday, Sarah actually waved to her. Marita described Steven as having men friends, which just meant a lot, but they never caused any trouble. She said she was actually very comfortable around Steven and never felt intimidated or threatened by him in any way. I can't help but wonder if these so-called friends that this woman kept seeing were actually people buying substances from Steven. Steven had been working laying papers, and his most recent employer described him as a good employee. But he had called in on the morning of November 19th and said he wouldn't be coming in and was expected to be away for a few days. It took another week after Sarah's body was found for the police to track Steven down at a friend's house in a second-story apartment on Caroline Street in the town of Hawthorne, about an hour away from Buce Marsh. They had a warrant for his arrest. and he went with 30 undercover, heavily armed special operations officers around 12:20 p.m. on Tuesday, November 20th, without incident. When he was arrested, he had a graze to his right cheekbone and the right side of his chin. He was wearing a blue rugby top with a yellow collar, green cargo shorts, and no shoes. An officer asked if he knew why he was being arrested, and Stephen replied, "Yes, murder." Then he said that he should be locked up until he died. His parole period had just expired only 11 days before Sarah was murdered. Now, they wanted to know what happened, and Stephen, of course, began denying that he had anything to do with what happened to Sarah, that he never harmed her, and that they were friends. They got along great. But then he would remark again that police should lock him up until he dies. He seemed to be very conflicted. It's like he wanted to confess, but he was apprehensive to do it. They kept pushing harder and harder, and finally, Stephen began to give in. He was giving information to them little by little and admitted to killing Sarah, but said that he couldn't explain why he killed her. He said, "I don't understand why. I really don't understand why." And then he said, "I am nothing." But soon, Stephen's version would come out. He explained that afternoon he and Sarah went to his condo to smoke meth and drink alcohol, and at some point, Stephen was cleaning the condo when he found a used syringe that belonged to his ex-girlfriend. That's when he made a disparaging remark about junkies. We already know Sarah is very sensitive about people calling her a junkie. It's just something that rubbed her the wrong way. Well, in Stephen's version, Sarah mistakenly believed that this comment was directed at her, so she began to yell at him. Then he said she hit him on the back while she was standing near the kitchen bench. He turned around, lost his balance, and fell to the tiled floor. When he got up, Sarah supposedly hit him again, at which point Stephen claimed he just lost his temper and snapped, attacking her with a hammer. But he says he doesn't remember ever stabbing her. He was much stronger and bigger than Sarah. He could have easily, and most likely did, overpower her before having to stab her 19 times. I say, having to stab her. He didn't have to stab her. It was completely unnecessary. She probably would have just died from being hit so hard over the head. However, it's believed that she was actually hit with those bloody dumbbells found in Stephen's garage and stabbed with a knife in his bedroom. Those were the murder weapons because the hammer was never located, according to the reports that I read. However, how similar does this story sound to Stephen's first murder? This girl takes offense at something he said, she attacks him, and then he has no choice but to defend himself with lethal force, even though he's bigger than these women. I'm not buying it. Stephen eventually admitted he left Sarah's body in his house for 2 days before deciding how he would proceed with covering up her murder. He went to extreme lengths to try to cover his tracks. He actually used Sarah's phone to send messages and call people and communicate with friends on social media so that it shifted any suspicion that she was dead. He also sent texts from his own phone to her, acting like they were still in conversation so that he wouldn't be looked at as being involved. On Sunday, the day after the murder, he actually texted Sarah at 10:07 a.m. saying, "Hey badass bandit, I just came to. I'm so hungover. What are you up to?" Then an hour later, he sent another text saying, "Hey you, it's me. Give me a call when you want to catch up." And then at 1:36 he texted, "Need my keys. Call me." He sent all these messages while knowing that Sarah was dead, lying on his kitchen floor. He was just trying to cover up what he had done. He also moved Sarah's car, which had been parked outside of his condo, and he moved it in front of that drug dealer's house on purpose. Then, Stephen returned to his condo on Monday, November 12th, the same day that Sarah was supposed to check into her detox center. He wrapped her body in a bag, then moved his car into the garage and put her inside the trunk of his car. After that, he drove to his friend's house, a guy that he actually served time with in prison, around 7:30 p.m. He said he messed up and he needed his help. He lied about what happened. He told this friend he was house-sitting and that he had a party and things got out of control. One of his friends killed Sarah accidentally, and now he needed to get rid of this body that was left at his place. Initially, this friend went to McDonald's with Stephen. They got a little bite to eat, which is just unbelievable to me, that you can even have an appetite at a time like this. But Stephen was more frantic. He told the friend he needed to act fast because the body was beginning to smell. So then they headed over to a local hardware store called Bunnings, where Stephen bought a 20L container of hydrochloric acid, 3 bags of rapid set concrete, 1 bag of garden lime, and a roll of black plastic. When they returned to the car to load things up, the friend was about to open the trunk, and Stephen said, "Don't, there's a body in there." That is when this friend decided he didn't want to help him anymore. Of course, Stephen kept pleading with him to please help. Then he asked him if he had a boat or somewhere that he could dispose of her out in the country, like some property he used to own. But this friend just checked out, and he left Stephen there to deal with it himself. On the next day, Tuesday, November 13th, Stephen drove to this new property that he had rented in Point Cook. He pulled into the garage, took Sarah's body out of the trunk, dumped her into that garbage bin, covered her with lime and concrete, then poured water over it and closed the lid. But once that concrete set, the bin was too heavy to move anywhere like Stephen had planned, and he knew the authorities were closing in on him. So he just left. He left Sarah there just to decompose. Anyone on the run? Stephen also told police that he burnt Sarah's personal items in a bonfire. Once the details of Sarah's murder were released to her loved ones and friends, they were beyond mortified, as you can probably imagine. Ashley said, with all those details, she could see it in her mind. She could hear it with her vivid imagination. She was playing everything out in her head, everything that her friend went through. Sarah's mom compared the way Stephen treated her beloved daughter as trash or poop, just something to discard, like she was nothing. She didn't understand how anyone could bludgeon and stab someone that they cared about, someone they called a friend. Hundreds of friends and relatives of Sarah's gathered at St. Andrew's Church for her memorial and funeral service. So many people showed up that they had to stand outside and listen to the service on speakers. Many of the people in attendance wore white ribbons condemning violence against women. It was heartbreaking to see Sarah's mom walking Sarah's beloved dog Sprocket on a pink leash beside her, and pallbearers all wearing Sarah's favorite color, pink. Instead of the typical black attire, she was laid to rest in a matching pink coffin, and the crowd released pink balloons into the sky to bid her farewell. Sarah's father, Adrian, said he understood the rage that many people felt about his daughter's death, but in his heartfelt eulogy, he asked for calm. He said, "We are gathered to honor and celebrate a life ended too soon, the life of our treasured daughter, a loved sister, cousin. She is her mother's world and my little princess." Sarah's mom wanted her to be remembered as bubbly and outgoing, with a smile that lit up a room, someone who radiated energy. The song "Over the Rainbow" played in the background as her coffin was carried from the church. Stephen ended up pleading guilty to Sarah's murder, sparing her family from a painful and drawn-out trial. But it wasn't until August of 2013, at a sentencing hearing, that the Crown argued for a life sentence with no parole, due to the seriousness of the offense and the fact that he covered up Sarah's murder, or at least tried to. But Stephen's defense lawyers blamed the murder on drugs. He said that Sarah and Stephen were both heavily intoxicated and high on meth the day of the murder, and that Stephen should be eligible for parole when he's an old man. The defense went into explicit detail about Stephen's traumatic upbringing in an attempt to get sympathy, and maybe to provide an explanation or an excuse for his actions. They shared that Stephen had a highly deprived upbringing characterized by physical violence, neglect, alcohol, and substances. As a child, he was burned with an iron and degraded for bedwetting. In one terrible incident, when he was 8 years old, his father, Murray, locked 3 of the children in a room, tied his mother to a chair, and Stephen was then portrayed as a hero to the court, as the defense explained that he managed to get free, run out of the room, and he saw his father with a shotgun to his mother. So he ran to get help. I mean, yeah, all of that stuff is devastating, terrible that a young person had to go through. But why kill people? Why do the same to others? It was now time for the victim impact statements. And wow, these were some of the most moving and heartbreaking ones that I've heard in a while. Sarah's mom, Noelle, and father, Adrian, stared at Stephen as they spoke while holding a pink ribbon and a framed picture of her daughter. Noelle explained how she's haunted by the thoughts of the gruesome attack. Every time she takes out her trash bins, she said, "Every fortnight, I'm reminded of the fact that my daughter, Sarah, was put in a wheelie bin encased with concrete to be thrown out like rubbish." Sarah was not a piece of rubbish. She was a beautiful, funny, and caring human being, loved by everyone who was privileged to be a part of her life. She spoke about how painful it is to think about never getting a chance to attend her only child's wedding or to be there when she had children of her own one day. All that was ripped away from Sarah and also from everyone who loved her. She said that Stephen's unforgivable act of violence means that she will never be able to see her daughter's remains or to tell her how much she loves her one more time. Sarah's father, Adrian, described Sarah as truly beautiful, as a loving soul, and he looked at Stephen while he spoke. He talked about whatever happens next, how their life has been changed for the worse for the rest of their lives. He also mentioned how ironic it was that his daughter had been denied justice when she was so passionate about studying the subject herself. It was Sarah's family that was serving a life sentence, since they had to spend the rest of their life without her. Even though Stephen was only feet away from Sarah's parents, he never made eye contact with them. The judge had to take all of this into consideration, both the Crown's argument and what the defense said, along with the impact statements. Ultimately, he determined that Stephen's actions required a sentence of life without parole. The judge explained that this murder of Sarah showed a propensity for violence, and even if he were to become old in jail and then eligible for parole, he was still likely to remain powerful enough to be an ongoing threat to the community. So he was never getting out. This time, and I say this time, mark my words because they're important, this man was released the first time he did the exact same thing to another woman. Sarah's friends and family clapped as his sentence was announced. It was a relief, especially to her mom. But years earlier, that same closure was short-lived when Jacqueline's family had to watch as Stephen was let out of his cage to roam again as a free man. There were still a couple of people in attendance who weren't thrilled about the sentence. It's true, one was Stephen's own father, Murray. He attended this hearing. This is the same man that we just heard about being violent, and he stated that this sentence was unfair and that Stephen hadn't been given a fair chance at rehabilitation after his first murder. What? That's one of the most unhinged things I think I've heard someone say in court. Unfair. And then one of Stephen's friends, Diane, who had known him for many years, said that this wasn't justice done, that Stephen was a very nice man. Those were her words, nice man. When you know him, as I'm sure anyone would, no one wants to get to know a murderer. But then she went on to call Stephen a scapegoat and said he's not a monster, that he needs to be given a chance, not to be caged up for life like an animal. Really? Because that's exactly where I think this animal and monster belonged. He called himself a dog. He said he should be locked up till he dies. That's what he wanted. Obviously, this friend of his didn't consider that Sarah and Jacqueline will never get a chance to get old. Stephen was finally locked up for good, far away from where he could ever hurt another woman again. But Sarah's story was far from over. The public and her family rightfully wanted to know how a man like this, with a violent history, was allowed back in the community in the first place. So after Sarah's death and years of advocacy from her mom, they ordered an inquest. 4 years after her death, this report was issued. It outlined a number of significant failures, and this led to why Stephen was unmonitored and able to go free again. Things like deliberately withholding psychological evaluations because they wanted a better history of criminals getting out on parole, because it shows that they're rehabilitated, even when he wasn't. Then it showed a caseworker who was just believing everything Stephen said, even though she had a history of what he had done. If he said, "Oh no, I've never done drugs and I'm not on drugs now," she would just believe him. She said because he had holes in his clothes, he must not be a drug dealer. Because if he was a drug dealer, he would have enough money for good clothes. That's not the way I would have seen it. It's clear that Stephen was good at lying. He was a pathological liar. It was determined during this inquest that Stephen was able to play the system. He simply lied and exploited the fact that this system prioritized getting criminals to parole rather than protecting the community. Stephen ended up admitting that he put up a facade. Sarah's mom agreed with the findings of the inquest, and she urged the recommendations to be taken seriously. Now, these recommendations from the court were that these violent offenders had to remain under supervision, just like what happens with sex offenders. Their past won't just disappear. Instead, they have to have curfews, electronic monitoring, and regular oversight from a parole manager. And I'm thinking, shouldn't that already have been happening? After all of this, after feeling like at least her family got some closure, guess what? Stephen appealed his life sentence. Yeah, his lawyers were arguing that it was excessive, and to top it off, he was requesting legal aid to fund all of the costs. Well, this didn't sit right with Sarah's family. Her mother actually spoke out about it, and she was like, if a convicted killer wants to appeal, then they should pay for it. She was like, they took someone's life, they forfeited their rights when they killed our children. And I couldn't agree more. In a letter to the court, Noelle said that Sarah doesn't get to come back to her after 30 years and carry on with her life and get her law degree, get married, and have children. She'll never get to see her daughter smile again. And that's so true. Sarah was given a death sentence, so why not give Stephen a life sentence? In the end, the High Court did determine that he would not be getting out. He was denied the appeal, and he was staying in prison for life. I want the final words of this case to belong to Noelle, who lost her only child because of the failures in the system that are meant to protect people like Sarah, to protect the community. When Sarah came out of detox, she was glowing, and she had so much zest for life. She was Sarah again, and she was going to be the lawyer, and she was going back to her studies, and, she wanted to travel, and she wanted to do so many things, and it's all just coming out, and to see her glowing again, it was just beautiful. And to think that, in a split second, it's all taken away by someone that should never have been on parole. And to think that, he's had so many chances in his life. Sarah got her one chance to get herself back on track and to be someone that she wanted to be, and he took that all away from her in a split second.